Somewhere in the lands of eternal frost, a castle stood tall, as if forged from ice and snow. In the lands of Belos, summer never came, and wanderers died, because they could not bear such terrible cold. It was in those places near the castle that a small group of people in red stood out, among whom was a child. A middle-aged man came out of the palace gates. He was blond with a small beard, and was dressed in a black suit. He was clutching a parchment tightly in his hand, and then, looking at the guests in surprise, he asked in a trembling voice, "What does all this mean?" He stopped, turning his gaze to the boy standing in front of him. Finally, the butler continued. He was asking if this was the son of His Majesty the Emperor. The boy in front of him was shivering with cold, looking at the man in front of him with surprise and regret. After a few moments, he nodded slightly. Suddenly, a cold male voice came from one of the emperor's messengers in red. The man said that since the message had been delivered, they would bow out. There was not a shadow of emotion visible on his face. He looked emotionlessly into the distance at the snowy paths. The man turned to the respected frost witch through clenched teeth. In front of him stood a girl with blue eyes, skin like snow, and long snow-white hair. She was completely at ease in the cold, although the only warm clothing she had on was a fur cape. The butler almost shouted out to observe etiquette, even if they are an envoy and His Majesty. How they dare not bend the knee after receiving an audience with Her Excellency the Archduchess. The man continued to wail, pointing his finger at the scoundrels. He was interrupted by a female voice, the girl asking Edmund to stop. The blonde looked at the people standing in front of her. She said that they would most likely die on the way, so it would be better to pray for the repose of their souls. They were all about the same age, although they differed greatly in appearance. The man wanted to object, but realizing that he had nothing to say, he fell silent. The boy with golden hair swallowed hard, imagining his future fate. He looked at his feet, at the snowdrifts, hoping not to run into someone's cold, indifferent gaze. Looking at the boy's face and watching him tremble, the girl said that she thought the child was cold. The youth raised his red eyes to her in surprise, as if he could not believe his own ears. His gaze was full of hope. The blonde extended her hand to him and called him to come in quickly. She tried to speak as kindly as possible. Looking at her very small guest, the butler had no choice but to smile cordially, observing the situation. There was a sound of muffled footsteps. The frost witch was leading him into the ice castle, hoping to warm him up. Her dress followed her as faithfully as a child, trying not to step away from her. The butler invited them into the guest room and said that he would serve them tea as soon as possible, moving away from the two people standing behind him. The girl responded with a brief yes. The boy could not believe his own eyes, continuing to look at the girl with interest. The girl leaned against the wall, thinking that this was the end. From the nervousness that arose from this unexpected situation, she barely staggered, but from the outside, it was hardly particularly noticeable. She looked sternly at the child. The girl thought that he had finally come, watching the boy. He stopped staring at her, but now he switched to the room he was in. He looked at the patterns on the walls, the furniture, the paintings, not leaving a single thing without attention. The blonde thought that this young man was a living disaster and sank deeper and deeper into your own thoughts. The girl remembered who she was in her past life. When she was 20, she got into a car accident in front of the university and died. She remembered the day she died. The last thing she remembered from the real world was unbearable pain. When she woke up, she turned out to be the witch Cleet from the novel The Tyrant's Heart. She didn't understand it right away, but her first guesses came after she looked in the mirror because her appearance completely matched the description from the book. The newly made Cleet remembered her first reaction to her new appearance. Then the girl could not believe that it was really her. Cleet was the Archduchess of Snow, ruling the lands where the snow never melts, the Queen of Snow, the Snow-White Witch, the Archduchess of Frost, and so on. A supporting character with many nicknames. All of this was the blonde beauty who proudly accepted all of fate's gifts. In this novel, Cleet could not resist the Emperor's orders, because of the sacred treaty that was written on a long yellowed parchment. But even despite this, it significantly influenced her fate, because it was signed by the first emperor. Therefore, she accepted the boy, having no other choice. However, because she did not give him a single drop of attention, he was completely useless to anyone for several years. And no matter how long the boy waited for his blonde frost witch, she never came. Even sitting on his lap, the boy would hardly see her motherly, loving nature. Later, when the crown prince, the only legitimate son and heir to the imperial throne, died of a chronic illness, the emperor returned the previously sent prince, who had already grown up and become stronger, being an illegitimate son. However, he refused to carry out his father's order and left Belos, becoming a wandering mercenary. So at the age of 20, he became a master of the sword and decided to usurp the throne. On the battlefield, he had already mercilessly killed people more than once, victoriously raising his bloody sword to the sky. It had already become a habit for him to literally walk over corpses. And so he decided to take such a courageous step. A woman's scream cut through the dead silence. A shrill voice called Arfin. The golden-haired man only smiled broadly in response, enjoying the blood smeared across his face. He wanted to take by force what was given to him for free. As a result, he became famous as a man with an ugly disposition. Cleet received the emperor's order and fought desperately against him, but eventually lost and was cornered. She had no choice but to unsuccessfully accept her death at the hands of her adopted son. But at the last moment, an idea came to mind. She gathered her last strength and cursed him, even though the sword was already at her throat. As she exhaled, she said, struggling with her inner agony, addressing Arfin as an invader. The girl said that, although fate would bring him to the highest place, it would take away the most radiant thing that would be in his life. He and his partner were to lose love and wander endlessly in the void. The man laughed and replied that love was trash and had no meaning for him, and he was sure that his wife would be an annoying girl who was always clinging to him. Since the witch had blessed him, the boy thought his future would be pretty smooth. He thanked the Archduchess for raising him. It's exactly like that. So, Arfin, a boy who grew into a young man after the murder of his father emperor, independently took the place on the throne. He killed many on the way to his goal, and he liked to hurt those who once hurt him. And after several years, an unexpected event occurred. Suddenly, fires flared up inside the golden-haired man. They burned everything in their path, leaving nothing alive, but resurrecting something long forgotten, something that he thought he could no longer experience. It was a day that was no different from the previous ones. The girl could not say exactly who she met, but she definitely remembered that the girl with long chestnut hair was surprised by the blood on the man's face. Then Arfin met the main character of the novel, Saint Ophelia. They fell in love at first sight and continued their secret meetings. They both longed for them, eagerly awaited each new walk, each touch and hug. Even just holding hands already caused a storm of emotions. But as soon as Arfin, tightly hugging his girlfriend, whispered in her ear that he loved her, the same curse sounded in his head that he and his partner should lose love, and the young man would wander endlessly in the void. The witch's voice repeated it over and over again, driving the young man crazy. Ophelia heard the curse too. Her face was distorted with fear, and despite the long-awaited words, she felt sick. Cleet's curse began to work. After a few moments, the girl realized that she was suffocating. Her vision began to darken. The chestnut-haired beauty saw murders, many bloodthirsty and cruel murders, and all these atrocities were committed by her beloved. In the vision, he was covered in blood, with a maddened smile, dealing with each of his enemies. Saint Ophelia finally saw his ruthless nature. Because of what she saw, the girl ran away from him, and the ending of the novel was their love that never came true. And again, no matter how much Arfin knelt before Ophelia, she would never again show her loving, tender nature, and a terrible end. But the witch reminded herself that it didn't matter now, returning from long thoughts. The main thing was that she had finally been delivered this crazy tyrant. The girl thought about this, looking for a pair of ruby eyes, as well as golden hair. She became Cleet long before he appeared. Although for some time, she was shocked that she had moved into a negative character. But the girl in this world simply has a wonderful appearance. She often praised her gorgeous face. Looking in the mirror, realizing that she still had a lot of time left, she completely relaxed, allowed herself to calmly explore the world, read books, even if they were not always moralizing. Finally, the girl could almost always do what she wanted. At least that's what she thought for 200 years. She could lie in bed all day and eat cookies, while the butler watched her procrastinate from the right side of the bed. There was practically nothing to do. There was still plenty of time. The girl thought that she should first pull herself together and tried to force herself to come up with some kind of plan. There must be something she had learned while having fun and eating goodies. Suddenly, a childish, timid voice sounded. The boy was asking for forgiveness. At first, the blonde witch thought she was imagining things. Did he really say something? But the boy said the word again, in an even more timid voice. But this time it was also trembling. He asked for forgiveness again, trying to attract the girl's attention. After a few moments, the child looked down in shame, but continued. He said that it seemed that being brought to Cleet so suddenly had caused great inconvenience. The red-eyed boy paused for a moment, thinking about his next words. Then he said that he was really very sorry. Face fell completely, and his gaze went dull. He said that if the witch so desired, she could send him back. The Witch of the Cold looked at the boy, not understanding how such a thing could have occurred to the child. The girl tried to understand the emotions of the future tyrant, and mentally wondered what he was even saying. The blue-eyed blonde looked contemptuously at the very small boy standing in front of her. Was this what a child should say in such a situation? The girl still could not understand where he had picked up such expressions. Did she really look so inhospitable that he apologized for his visit? The blonde kept looking at the boy and thought that this cowardly boy didn't look like the tyrant from that story. Well, no matter how you looked at it, he simply couldn't be that tyrant. His eyes were red like two rubies. His hair was golden. He was shaking violently, either from the cold or from fear. The girl awkwardly stretched out her snow-white hand towards the golden-haired child. Her mind told her not to doubt anything and kill the child. The girl struggled with my own thoughts. She abruptly looked away, but judging by the fact that she couldn't do it with a light heart, it meant that even after 200 years, her true character had not turned into a witch, but remained an ordinary person. It turned out that even she had a conscience. Cleet's eyes grew cloudy, and her pupils darted from side to side. The girl tried to control her breathing and stop her hysteria. A new idea suddenly came to her. She thought about what might happen if she killed the boy right now. An image of a handsome, golden-haired young man appeared in her mind, who was not a bloodthirsty tyrant, but, for example, loved nature, flowers. Perhaps this could happen. If suddenly she raised him well, was it possible that the future would change? Cleet wanted to believe it, even if he didn't have a great character. Couldn't she make him into a pretty good person? The girl dreamed that she could change the boy's future by raising him to be a kind and polite person. Couldn't she raise him so that he would kill me? The girl decided that she would at least try. She had to start acting now. But here's the problem. The girl didn't know how to handle children. She coughed, barely audibly, trying to draw the child's attention to herself. The girl asked what kind of absurdity this was, and carefully watched the boy's reaction to her words. His face was tear-stained. Whole storms of tears were rolling down from his eyes. His nose was pink, and his body was shaking relentlessly. The girl, frowning, leaned closer to the boy. Her eyes seemed to flare up with a bright blue fire. The blonde whispered, "Was it really? Did he really think she was so weak that one small child could cause her inconvenience?" His trembling only increased. and tears quickly flowed from his eyes again. The girl looked at the golden-haired young man in bewilderment. It was obvious that he was trying to restrain his emotions, but he was not very successful. The blonde wanted to scream, but remembering that there was a very young future tyrant here, she kept silent, only thinking with displeasure, "Why did he look like he was going to cry?" She said it as kindly as possible, and then she asked where he was going to go back, thereby finishing the boy off even more. The girl reminded herself of the first rule of friendliness. It said that the main thing in any situation is to smile. She looked at the boy coldly, her lips curling into a strange smile. Her eyes, reflecting the light, were half closed. This grimace looked scary enough, but after the girl said that the boy had nowhere to go, her face became even more frightening. Finally, the boy could hold back no longer. He covered his mouth with his hands to hide the occasional sobs that seemed to be heard throughout the building. All the tears he had been holding back until now poured out of his eyes. Clat sincerely did not understand what she was doing wrong. The butler immediately came running to the annoying sobs of the young man. He called out to Her Excellency and asked why she was making the child cry, moving the boy closer to herself. Perplexedly watching the picture unfolding before her, the girl answered that she had not even intended to make him cry, and had not said anything like that at all. Patting the boy on the shoulder, the man, hoping to calm him down, told him to calm down. The butler assured the boy that Cleet was not as scary as she might seem. Sighing heavily and raising an irritated eyebrow, the blonde tried to understand what she had done wrong. But she stopped in the middle of her thoughts, realizing that now was not the best time to sort things out within herself. She decided that something needed to be done urgently, but continued to watch in confusion a certain sweet picture that made her chest hurt and her teeth clench. The boy clinging to the butler's shoulder sobbed loudly, no longer embarrassed by his own sobs. Cleet thought that if she valued her life, she should raise this child as obedient and kind as possible. The sounds of a child's crying could be heard throughout the room. The child was whining loudly, not embarrassed by the presence of other people. Finally, the loud voice of the butler was heard, which interrupted Arfin's sobs. The man again addressed Her Excellency. The old butler continued to hug the boy. He asked what the girl had said that made the gentleman so upset. He looked sullenly at the lady, but she only shrugged her shoulders in confusion and replied that she had really done nothing. The butler believed that she had done nothing. After all, this girl looked scary, even when she was just standing still. The witch asked what he was talking about, to which she received a rather rude answer. The man sent her to look in the mirror to make sure of her scary appearance. The girl left the room that very second and went to the nearest mirror. Finally, in one of the spacious rooms, she found a large floor-length mirror. Approaching it, the girl began to examine herself, trying to find what the butler was talking about. The lady smiled tenderly at her reflection and said that she was beautiful. The girl thanked Edmund for being able to him, she saw something amazing. She ran her hand over her cheeks, outlining the silhouette of her face. Her skin was soft, like high-quality silk, and her fingers were thin. Returning, the lady immediately turned to the man mockingly. Had he really forgotten how in his youth he had been in love and had run after her sobbing? Remembering, she quoted how Edmund had confessed his love to her. Then his voice trembled, and the thorns of the rose he was clutching in his hand dug into his skin. The butler abruptly began to justify himself by saying that he was young and inexperienced. Rolling his eyes, he continued his thought that the girl was very beautiful, but her face was cold, like ice. The man flared up. The girl just looked at him irritably. She mentally cursed the man for such comments about her beautiful appearance. The man asked, what child wouldn't be scared when looking at her? His voice was more polite this time. The blonde witch turned her gaze to the child, who was still sobbing, clinging to the man. His sobs became less audible. The butler smiled warmly at Arfin. He asked the boy not to cry, saying that his smile would suit his face much better, and calling him a dear prince. He pressed the child even closer to himself, patting him lightly on the back. The lady looked at how quickly they found a common language and began to curse the butler even more. He had just been rude to her, and now he was being so coddling with this child. The gray-haired man, as if coming to his senses, looked at the lady in bewilderment and asked, "Why did the emperor send his precious child here?" The child in his arms calmed down a little and was no longer shaking so much. The butler was still looking at the witch with a puzzled look and added that the road here was very harsh. The girl thought that asking such questions in front of the child was the height of tactlessness. She lowered her eyes to the floor, thinking about what words would be best to say so as not to offend the child. Still, the witch could find nothing better to do than to say directly that she had been asked to become the guardian of this child. The butler could not believe that the emperor had asked such a person as her about this. The golden-haired boy in his arms shuddered and turned his gaze to the lady. The girl asked Edmund why he wanted to die. Today the butler did not watch his language at all. The girl started to say that this child could ruin her life, but then she remembered the child standing in front of her. She shook her head, trying to find the right words. In the end, the best she could come up with was that it was because he could not officially become part of the imperial family. Edmund regretted it. The butler came to his senses and suddenly fell silent, not allowing himself to finish his own speech. It was not for him to decide imperial affairs. He thought about this and exhaled heavily, then turned his gaze to the golden-haired boy standing in front of him. The man gently ran his hand over the little prince's cheeks, wiping away his tears and calling him unhappy. He tried to say it as gently as possible. Would such a child be able to grow up safely in this alienated place? The girl answered emotionlessly that if you raise him with due attention, he will definitely not die. The only problem was what he will become. The blonde witch already knew what will happen in the future, so she was very concerned about it. The lady said thoughtfully that the boy seemed to have stopped crying. She coldly ordered the butler to find a good room for the boy. Her order echoed throughout the room. Edmund replied briefly that everything would be done. The Witch of the Cold suddenly remembered something and quickly muttered something in the direction of the two retreating silhouettes. They immediately turned around. The butler was clearly very surprised by such an outburst of the mistress, and the golden-haired boy with tears in his eyes looked at the girl with interest. The blonde lady stuttered and told the butler to choose a warm room for him. At the end of her sentence, she even added the word please, which was unlike her. She was clearly embarrassed by her own words, and therefore bashfully lowered her eyes to the floor. The girl crossed her arms over her chest and breathed heavily. The butler's eyes widened as he looked at the lady, but the boy did not stop crying for a second. She had heard that small children were very weak, so they caught cold easily. The girl tried to explain her request with this. The butler smiled broadly and said that he understood her. The girl, in response, only looked sternly with her bright blue eyes, and in a cold tone said that if he understood, then stop mocking, let the butler go where he was going. The blonde beauty stared at the two people walking away from her. The sounds of their footsteps echoed throughout the hall. The butler carefully held the hand of the little golden-haired prince, as if afraid to hurt him. When the silhouettes disappeared from view, the Witch of the Cold thought, looking away, the child has arrived. I think I should at least write a letter to the emperor. She was immersed in the already painfully familiar routine, thinking about the things she needed to do. Somewhere in the distance, in the lands of eternal cold and frost, a dark, cold night reigned in Belos. The girl remembered the events of today and thought that those messengers were probably no longer tenants. It would be difficult to hold out in such cold for a long time, even for a prepared person. Suddenly, that same night, it started snowing. Not very hard at all. Usually, it is in this kind of weather that children go out for a walk, the blonde beauty thought. She looked out the window and saw several children sticking carrots into a snowman. Even later that night, when the children had long since gone to bed, the snowfall intensified. It was so heavy that the snowman fell apart in a matter of seconds. Such weather was not at all unusual here. The snowfall gradually turned into ice. The roof was pounded by icicles falling straight from the sky. The lady thought that it's good that everyone is already home, realizing that being outside in such weather could lead to injuries. 2 weeks passed unnoticed. The Witch of the Colds almost never encountered the boy, and if they did, he no longer began to cry from just one look at her. The rest of the time, she was completely immersed in routine. Suddenly, a woman's laughter came from the room. The hand clutching the letter trembled slightly. The girl muttered to herself that 100 years ago, she had written to the emperor that his child had reached her, and he had only now deigned to answer. With a few quick movements, the girl tore the parchment. Then Cleet began tearing the paper into even smaller pieces. The letter did not say a word about worrying about the child, or what kind of person this emperor was. The lady almost screamed as she gave in to her emotions. She carelessly threw the imperial letter into the red-hot fireplace behind her. The fire quickly burned the paper, as well as the ink on it. The blonde witch looked at the flames with disdain. The girl was afraid that someone would hear her speech, so she quietly stated that now she understood why his own child killed him. But then she remembered that the walls in the castle were quite thick, so she could even scream, and no one would hear. Looking at the flame, the witch remembered the strange scarlet eyes that looked at her with curiosity every time she left the room. Tita. It seemed he said that his childhood name was Tita. That day, the boy smiled modestly. Looking from his new guardian to the butler, the little prince nervously tugged at his clothes and said to call him Tita. Cleet immediately realized that the boy was very nervous. Leaning towards the lady, the butler quietly whispered in her ear that the word Tita did not mean the sound of a burning flame. The girl leaned closer to him to hear his speech more clearly, and then replied that she believed that was the case. This name was given to me by my mother when she was at the fire. The boy said it, and immediately dispelled all doubts. The gray-haired man looked at him in surprise, but the blonde girl only with distrust and caution. The girl walked past the flames that were devouring what had recently been precious letters. Well, his mother, a commoner, could have given him such a name, the lady thought, finishing her nostalgia. The Witch of the Cold laughed softly, gathering memories from the book's plot and reality together, but still, the ruthless tyrant's childhood name was Tita. Smiling broadly, the girl slowly walked around the room. Suddenly, the witch remembered Cleet's hopeless situation from the book. She thought that she might die at his hands. She shook her head a couple of times, trying to shake off this obsession. Taking several potion jars in her hands, the girl leaned towards her cauldron. She had a couple of well-folded papyri under her hand. The lady thought that now was not the time for this, and she needed to prepare the potion. The girl was driving away old memories. Potions and magic scrolls were a necessity in the isolated Bellows. Even though people had lived here since birth, they were still prone to colds and deaths. Potions could be different. Some helped to cope with one ailment, and others with the opposite. One of the most important duties of a witch was to distribute them to the few inhabitants of her regions. When she was engaged in this kind of charity, astonished sighs and exclamations were always heard. If he were inattentive to his work, then Bellows would turn into a land of death, teeming with monsters. And now, of course, many were afraid to go through these lands. But what would happen when the number of monsters increased here? Thinking about what other potions she could add, the girl stirred the liquid in the cauldron, which should have started to thicken very soon. The room darkened. The fair-haired girl looked for candles all over the room. Finally, a strange blue muted light began to emanate from the potion. Cleet picked up a huge spoon and slowly added the liquid. Nothing much changed, only the light became much brighter. Without ceasing to stir slowly and carefully, the witch did not move a single step away from her boiled potion. The liquid became brighter and brighter, illuminating the entire space in which the cauldron was located. As she walked away, the girl looked out the window and thought, God, so much time had passed. While the potion was boiling, the witch looked at the aftermath of the snowfall. The snowmen were destroyed, and there were whole piles of snow on the trees. First, it was necessary to take Edmund his medicine for old age shoulder disease. The girl opened a new potion. She remembered how the butler always complained about his shoulders. Well, old age is no fun. The lady understood that perfectly well. She had to hurry, otherwise he would fall asleep. The girl picked up a couple of scrolls and the necessary potions to hand them to the gray-haired man. She took a couple of steps forward for a more convenient teleportation. The girl quickly teleported to another point in the ice castle. In just one moment, she could move to different locations, cutting through space and leaving behind only a blue trail. A fair-haired girl appeared near the ceiling. The lady wondered again if the butler was asleep. She looked down and realized that the butler was not there, but there was a small child on whom she was about to fall. She was very surprised when she realized that she had made a rather gross error in teleportation. A strong flow of air threw her hair upwards, and because of the lighting, they seemed light pink for a moment. The little golden-haired prince turned around in confusion, looking in surprise at the witch falling down from the ceiling. He reflexively opened his mouth wide in surprise, but quickly covered it with his hand. He stared at the girl, and suddenly, the potion that the Archduchess was holding fell. It shattered into pieces, and a thick purple liquid poured out of it. Cleet knelt down next to the broken bottle, and the boy did the same. The lady held out her hand to him and said that the chip might have flown off, so he should be careful. Only in the last sentence did she try to briefly express her tender feelings, which made her voice tremble a little. She was warning him not to hurt himself. The Archduchess looked at the boy in front of her. He began to tremble violently again, and to apologize in a low voice. He was asking for forgiveness for literally nothing. The prince's voice was shaking, and he himself began to stutter from fear. And why was he asking for forgiveness? It was she who made a mistake. Cleet couldn't understand this reaction. She continued to look at the boy, who was still shaking very badly. What had he already done? Or was it she who did something? Bitter tears flowed from his blood-colored eyes. I was wrong. The little prince almost cried out. He folded his hands in prayer and shook them from side to side. I really did something very bad. Forgive me, the youth exclaimed. Rising from her knees, the girl walked quickly and decisively towards the boy opposite. Listen, no, Tita, everything is fine, so stop apologizing, the lady said, turning to him. Who had frightened him so? She thought. Forgive me, Your Excellency. Forgive me. The childish voice began to chirp again. Despite the fact that the Archduchess tried to calm her adopted son, he continued to cry and shake at every rustle. The little prince dug his nails into his skin even harder, and having made up his mind, asked the question, would she do anything to him? Shaking his head, the boy asked again if she was going to turn him into a frog. He didn't shout it in the blonde witch's face. The girl couldn't even imagine such an outcome. A frog? What? What was this for now? She thought, trying to remember who she had last turned into a frog. The little prince cried much more than before while begging. He screamed loudly that he was wrong and begged not to turn him into a frog. The Archduchess did not know how to calm crying children, much less how to calm hysterics. The boy sobbed and said that he simply hated frogs, but this shocked the girl even more. What kind of frogs out of the blue? The blonde witch thought, looking at the child who was still begging on his knees. A frog. Why was he suddenly talking about her? The blonde witch couldn't understand, towering over the boy. The absurdity of the situation made her want to cry and laugh at the same time. She looked at the child in bewilderment, not knowing how to calm him down. His mother told him that if he didn't listen to the witch, she would turn him into a frog. The timid, trembling voice of the little boy was heard. The boy was wiping away his tears because he had not stopped crying from fear for a second. The boy said plaintively that he would never do that and would be obedient. He asked not to turn him into a frog. The girl said that she would never do that, so he should get up quickly. And then she thought about what they would do if a glass was stuck in his knee. And why would she turn him into a frog alone? the lady reasoned, trying to understand the child's logic. She could have made at least 100 of them. The girl thought, imagining why she might need a frog army. The butler came running at the sound of screams and crying. "Oh my God, what's going on here?" he cried, running up to the trembling boy, who was still kneeling. He suddenly began to cry. The witch looked at the man and said that she really hadn't done anything. He hugged the little boy and quietly asked why Master Tita was crying. He pressed him closer to himself. The golden-haired prince, breathlessly, answered that he did not want to turn into a frog. In his arms, he began to tremble less. He must have gotten used to the butler. "What does that mean?" the man asked, looking sullenly at his cold-blooded mistress. "I didn't say that." The lady shook her head in response, trying to protect herself from the butler's moralizing about how to treat children. The man said that Her Excellency should choose her words better when speaking to a small child. The girl rolled her eyes and replied in a tired voice that she had said nothing of the sort. But the butler believed in his truth, continuing to say that the girl had also made the child kneel. The girl shrugged and said that he had assumed that position himself. She paused and asked what the big deal was about turning into a frog. After all, she was the one who was the mistress of this castle, so she set the rules too. An awkward silence fell between them. The older man glared at the girl. The only thing that broke the tense atmosphere was the loud sobs of the tyrant child. The blonde witch quickly mumbled something that sounded like an apology. The lady let out a heavy sigh and looked at the child, who was shaking violently. She realized that it would take him a long time to calm down, so she should at least try to fix the situation. "Okay, I won't make a frog out of you, so please stop crying already," the witch said in a soothing voice. "But if there are shards around you, don't move suddenly under any circumstances." She glanced sideways at the broken glass bottle from which purple liquid was flowing. Its shards were scattered all over the room, and therefore it was easy to hurt yourself on it. "Do you understand me?" the witch asked the child. She looked at the boy sternly and said in a cold voice, "Or else I will turn you not just into a frog, but into an ugly toad." Having said this, she crossed her arms over her chest, trying to look as convincing and intimidating as possible. This time it was the butler who got scared. He hugged the boy tighter and then covered his ears so he wouldn't hear the blonde witch's voice. "What else did he want from her?" the girl asked, tilting her head to the side. The man asked Tita not to cry as he released the boy from his embrace. He smiled warmly at the child and continued his monologue. He assured him that Her Excellency was only talking like that, but in reality, she would never do that. The butler leaned over to the boy and said that if he asked her to read him a bedtime story, Cleet would read it very kindly. He finally stopped shaking, almost completely, and no longer cried. The lady was shocked by this. She asked if the butler really thought she had so much free time. "Really?" the little prince asked the old man. His eyes widened, clearly not believing his words. "Of course, ask her soon," the butler answered, patting him on the shoulders encouragingly. The boy slowly turned to the lady and asked in a trembling voice, "Your Excellency, will you read me a bedtime story?" He was very worried and therefore stuttered a little. His eyes were filled with hope, and it seemed that they even glowed. "It's blinding," the blonde witch thought. She was ready red. If only he would stop looking at her like that. But the child only lit up even more, only from happiness. He must have been waiting for this moment for a long time. She just didn't know how to express it. The little golden-haired prince continued, "Because she had lived alone for too long." The witch looked at the boy in bewilderment. She clearly hadn't expected such conclusions from him. She thought he was a fool who could only repeat about frogs. But he could think like that too. She looked at the boy and said she paid for forcing her feelings on him in the wrong way. The golden-haired baby tyrant raised his head and also opened his red-crimson eyes wide and exclaimed. But the boy knew about her feelings. He looked at his snowy, fair-haired mistress in amazement. The girl closed the book and asked him with interest why he thought so. The boy was very worried, and his voice was shaking. He answered that it was because when he had pieces of ice in him, he was looking at the same thing she was looking at, and knew what she was thinking. Placing a snow-white hand on the book, the lady asked, did he share her thoughts? The boy nodded vigorously and answered, yes. He must have known that she liked him very much. He looked awkwardly at the witch, who was considering his words. Then why did he kill her? The snow lady finally asked the child. I don't know. Tita was a little ashamed that he couldn't answer all of his new mother's questions, and so he rubbed his palms awkwardly and looked down. The lady was thinking, who would have thought that we would argue so heatedly over a children's book? She turned to the boy and said, he seemed to like fairy tales. There were quite a few in the library, so the boy I could read if he got bored. The small golden-haired prince hesitated and blushed. He looked sheepishly at the fair-haired witch sitting in front of him. She was examining the hard cover of the book, not knowing what to do with herself. In fact, I can't read, the boy said quietly, after such a long pause. The lady looked at the boy in bewilderment and asked, what? You don't know how? The little prince shuddered, but raised his eyes and looked shyly at the snow-white lady. I didn't learn this. He spoke barely audibly. Even if they threw it away, how can you not teach a child to read until he's 7? What were they even doing there? No, you can't say that in front of a child, the blonde thought, trying to find a way out of the situation. In that case, she paused for a moment. Then I will teach you, the blonde witch continued. She smiled faintly at the boy, who blushed deeply in response, and looked at the girl with eyes shining with happiness. He asked, not believing it. Really? Yes, it's true. It's true, the blonde exclaimed, looking away from him. So tomorrow, when you wake up, go straight to the workshop. The joyful prince did not stop smiling brightly. Good, he exclaimed, looking at the lady. Well, it's late, so go to sleep soon, said the lady, quickly getting up from the little boy's bed. Yes, Your Excellency. This time the prince smiled more reservedly. Good night to you, he said, getting under the covers. Yeah, the blonde witch said quietly, slowly closing the creaky wooden door behind her. She smiled faintly, and her eyes shone in the pitch darkness. See you tomorrow, Tita. She took one last look at the little prince and left the room. The boy only clutched the book tighter. After that night, it had become his favorite fairy tale. He closed his eyes and leaned back on the red pillows. The sooner I fall asleep, the sooner tomorrow will come, he thought, and rolled over onto his side. The blonde witch walked in complete silence. Only the sound of her heels ringing interrupted the oppressive atmosphere. She carried a brightly burning candle in her hand, which she had just recently lit. The girl was thinking about the future, about the book, about her death. That evening surprised the cold-blooded lady in many ways, but most of all she remembered the moment when Tita defended the Snow Queen and said that she loved the boy. Then he looked at her with burning eyes and spoke in an inspired voice. Poor Snow Queen. She sincerely loved the boy. Somewhere deep in her chest, a small hope settled. She looked sternly down the hallway, slowly walking toward her room. Perhaps she thought, did not dare finish her own thought. She remembered the ruthless tyrant who always won, Arfin. But she also remembered the very little Tita, who loved bedtime stories and could not write at all. Perhaps I still have hope, the lady thought. Next to the young gentleman lay a recently read fairy tale. The little prince was fast asleep, clutching a thick blanket in his hand. Outside the window, the bright blinding sun was already shining high, despite the cold weather. The golden-haired tyrant suddenly opened his eyes. He saw light from the windows, and therefore realized that it was early morning. He remembered the words the witch had told him yesterday. He needed to get ready for her as quickly as possible. The prince quickly got out of bed and started packing. First of all, he decided to pack his bag. Taking several empty notebooks from the table, he carefully put them in his backpack, along with ink and a pen. Then he went to the bathroom. Because he had gone to bed quite late the night before, he had not slept well. The cool water washed away any desire to sleep, and then he took a hot bath to keep warm in such cold weather. The blonde witch enjoyed the solitude and silence in her workshop. She smiled, slowly, carefully turning the pages of her latest novel. Silence and calm. The Snow Lady thought. She smiled softly as she thought, I'll enjoy this serenity a little longer before the little tyrant comes. She enjoyed the quiet of the early morning, and the little cool from the open windows, and the new romance. Your Excellency, I'm here. The girl shuddered in surprise. Suddenly, a childish voice of a boy was heard. He burst into the room without knocking, leaving the blonde in bewilderment. She immediately put down the book she was holding in her hands. The witch slowly stood up and walked around the chair. And you're early, she said, thinking beforehand. I thought he wouldn't be in a hurry and showed up around lunchtime. The girl felt a little awkward for a moment. The blonde turned and walked to the desk. The boy tried to keep up and ran after her. Finally reaching the table, the lady said, Sit here. The prince was full of joy and enthusiasm. Good, he almost exclaimed. Having sat down at the desk, the little boy realized that his chin barely reached the desk. His legs swung, not reaching the floor. He awkwardly grabbed the edge of the table with his hands and looked at the Snow Lady with curiosity. Look at this horrible tyrant, thought the lady, mocking the little prince. But naturally, she did not say it. The girl said emotionlessly, I suppose the chair and table are too big for you, but there is a solution to all this. The blonde witch continued her speech. She lightly snapped her fingers, and some strange blue hologram appeared from her hand. It looked like water, as if someone's full bottle had broken in the sky. Suddenly, there was a loud knock. The table instantly became smaller, and the chair became much more suitable for such a small baby. A tyrant. He looked in surprise at the magic that had created such a miracle, and then turned his gaze to the lady. The boy, blushing, exclaimed, Wow, they've shrunk. And then, looking at the table, he asked, Is it magic? The girl shrugged and answered, Exactly. Then she thought, Well, are you surprised, kid? So maybe I can hit you even harder, the girl thought, wondering what else could be created from magic. Her thoughts were spinning chaotically in her head. After a while, she raised her hand up, and a blue shining light poured out of the flower in her palm. Letters appeared above the golden-haired boy's head. They twirled in the air on waves of magic, creating simple patterns. The little prince watched the alphabet shimmering in blue, amazed and enchanted. Unbelievable, exclaimed the little tyrant. His eyes were shining, and his chubby little cheeks were slightly red. He opened his mouth in surprise, trying not to miss a single letter flying before his eyes. The blonde witch thought mockingly, Just look at that stupid expression. The boy was pointing at a letter and saying what it was called. If you click on a letter, you can hear its pronunciation. So I'll remember them for now, because I'll give you an exam later. The little prince took a couple of books and ink and a pen out of his backpack. Looking at the letters, he began to carefully write them down on paper. If you do anything else, I'll scold you, just so you know. The cold voice of the lady rang out. The girl laid out empty bottles in front of her. Remembering which potions she should have made today, she thought, glad that she wouldn't have to spend much time with the boy. Well, baby, now you'll have to sit over this all day. The blonde witch exhaled heavily and thought with relief. Okay, I'll do the potions for now. She sat down closer to the table and picked up a notebook in which she had written down her plan for the coming week. Suddenly, the little golden-haired prince rose silently from his chair and quickly walked towards the Snow Lady. Approaching her from the side, he addressed the girl. Your Excellency, he said in a ringing voice. The Snow Lady jumped in surprise and almost jumped. She cried out loudly, You scared me. What are you doing? It's dangerous, so move away. The boy stood awkwardly nearby and answered, I remembered everything you said. The fair-haired lady looked at the little golden-haired prince with bewilderment. What? Already? So quickly? She asked, not believing a single word the little boy was saying. He was standing right next to her, clutching the piece of paper with the letters tightly. After a short pause, the blonde exhaled heavily and asked, "Are you sure you can pass the exam right now?" The boy nodded confidently. "If you deceive me, I will punish you," the blonde witch exclaimed. The blonde witch said thoughtfully, "Well done." It seemed that the boy was about to light up with happiness. Then the lady thought, "He said that he never learned anything. After all, the main character always remains him." Then the lady began to think, what should she teach him now? She had expected that it would take her at least 4 days to learn the alphabet alone, so she had prepared nothing at all. The little prince suddenly addressed the girl as Her Excellency. In a quiet voice, the golden-haired little prince said that he wanted to ask her something. He shifted awkwardly in his chair, fiddling with the edges of his clothes with his hands. He blushed slightly from embarrassment. Cleet didn't hear him the first time, so she asked again what Tita had just said. "Could you show me how to spell your name?" the boy finally asked, awkwardly looking down at the floor. "What?" the blonde witch asked, startled. She clearly hadn't expected such a request from a kid who had just learned the alphabet. There was an awkward pause, with only the sound of the potion bubbling as it brewed behind the newly formed family. Finally, the girl asked, "Why did you suddenly need my name?" The boy looked nervous, but answered, "Because I learned the entire alphabet. Now I want to learn your name." The little tyrant continued, in a trembling voice. In response, the blonde frowned slightly and thought, "That's exactly why I'm asking." "Why my name?" the girl thought, puzzled. She lightly brushed away the alphabet with her hand, and with a thin white finger wrote her name on the blue glowing liquid that was spreading across the ceiling. Cleet. She read her neat, calligraphic handwriting. The little prince watched the lady's magic, fascinated. "It reads Clate." She said it, and then repeated it again. Clate. The boy quickly picked up a pen and ink from the table and began writing her name. Then the lady erased her name with her palm. Well, and at the same time, she paused for a moment, writing new letters in the air. "Here is your name. Tita." The girl spoke in a soothing voice. The little prince carefully wrote out each letter that the lady wrote. She glanced awkwardly at the little golden-haired prince, who was painstakingly writing each symbol. What a funny little boy. A thought suddenly occurred to her. Isn't it usually the first name one asks for that isn't one's own? The boy looked at his piece of paper and muttered under his breath, "Cleet, Tita." Sometimes he paused briefly between words, but then continued whispering and writing out letters. "Your Excellency." The boy, who had just finished his own thoughts, turned to her. The fair-haired witch turned to him indifferently and asked in a displeased voice, "What happened again?" Suddenly, the boy smiled brightly and said, "Thank you." The girl didn't understand at first, so she looked questioningly at the little prince and answered, "I don't think I've done anything that deserves gratitude." Shifted awkwardly from one foot to the other. He fidgeted in place, not knowing what to do with himself from the insistence of the Snow Lady's gaze. "The day I first came here, you said something." The boy finally said, "I think the child is cold." The cold voice of an unfamiliar lady sounded. The boy, not believing his own ears, looked at the girl with distrust. He raised his head sharply and watched her, trying to find a catch in her words. The butler stood before the witch. At first, he seemed like a stern man, but when he looked at the baby, he smiled warmly. The blonde extended her hand, cold as snow, and said, "Come in quickly." "You said that I might be cold," said the golden-haired youth, looking at the tall lady in front of him. He was clutching a piece of paper tightly in his hands, with names neatly written on it. The lady looked at the boy indifferently, crossing her arms over her chest. The golden-haired little prince smiled brightly and looked at the fair-haired witch with admiration with his bright crimson eyes. They reflected the bright sunlight and therefore seemed to glow. Finally, the boy said, "You were the first man." He paused for a moment, not daring to continue the thought. Finally making up his mind, the young man said, "You were the first person who was worried about me." He said it without ceasing to smile brightly. The lady was surprised by his words. She clearly did not expect that her behavior would be perceived in such an unusual way. Unexpectedly for herself, the blonde blushed deeply. She did not know how to explain the sharp warmth that settled somewhere in her chest. Her heart began to pound quickly, and her thoughts were knocked out of her head. "Well, I didn't exactly." The lady spoke, stuttering. Turning sharply to avoid that childish, inquisitive gaze, the witch said, "Well, it's not that I was particularly worried. I just thought that if I left a little one like you standing there any longer, you might freeze to death." The boy replied, "And thank you for teaching me my letters. That's why I wanted to know your name first." The golden-haired little prince continued speaking. He clutched the precious piece of paper even tighter and blushed, looking at the tall silhouette of the lady. The blonde girl frowned as she listened to the little boy's inspiring speech. She couldn't stop blushing. And then she thought, how should I react to this statement? The prince came closer to the lady, who had moved away from him a couple of steps. "Okay, if you've said everything, you can go back to your place, and be sure to repeat what you've learned today," the blonde said in a trembling voice. "Okay." The baby answered her happily. Turning around, the very small youth headed towards the workshop exit. "In the end," he said in a ringing voice, "I am very grateful to you for today, Your Excellency." He gave a last joyful smile and left the room. Hearing the sound of the door closing, the girl looked away, where only recently stood a warmly smiling little, restless prince. She still couldn't get rid of the bright blush on her cheeks, and therefore looked embarrassed. The blonde witch recalled his recent words. She was the first person who was worried about Tita. Was it really true? And he spoke with such a happy face. You should cry over him, the girl thought, recalling his silhouette. He forgot his test slip, the blonde lady thought as she moved closer to the children's table. She picked it up thoughtfully and then walked with him to the counter where she kept her notebooks, jars, and bottles. Having pinned the piece of paper to the wall with a few push pins, the blonde girl quickly went to the other end of the workshop to the brewing potion, muttering under her breath in displeasure. "A very annoying fellow. We must quickly teach him the basics and get rid of him." Handing him over to Edmund, the snow lady said a little louder, coming closer to the table. She took one last look at the piece of paper. His name was written there, and next to it was a careless, childish drawing of a rabbit. A week had passed since then. Every day the boy improved his writing and reading skills. He could already write not only his own name, but also Cleet's. The girl gave him another test, and Tita, as usual, quickly passed it. The lady was puzzled how he could learn so quickly. This was the last test from Cleet. Now that she had explained the basics to the boy, he could calmly move on to Edmund's training. The witch called him, saying that she was handing the boy over to him. The butler nodded and smiled in agreement. The girl was about to leave the room, but then she remembered the most important thing. She turned to Edmund again, telling him not to teach Tita the art of swordsmanship or other martial arts under any circumstances. The man did not understand why she was so strict, but he still listened. Buff after all. Only a second later, the girl realized that this phrase about the buff had not flashed through her mind, but had burst out of her mouth. The butler asked again what the girl had just said. She looked away, pretending not to understand what he was talking about, and then asked if the boy had shown any other character. Now it was the butler's turn to be puzzled. He asked again, what other character were we talking about? The witch answered that he could, for example, suddenly start swearing or showing cruelty. In her head, an image of Tita, squatting, extorting potions, immediately appeared. Edmund tilted his head in confusion, asking if his mistress was joking. He had never thought that the thoughts of this noble witch could be occupied with something like that. And how could such a diligent student start behaving so impudently? It did not fit into the butler's head. The butler added, "Doesn't the witch know that the only fault of this boy is his excessive simplicity?" In Edmund's eyes, Tita was a dandelion from God. Clayt looked away and quietly agreed. After that, the man with the monocle raised his hand to his head, stroking his mustache, and looked up, as if remembering something. He said that he could tell her something. The girl turned around sharply and looked at him questioningly. The witch expected to hear the worst. After all the events she remembered from this book, she was prepared for anything. But fortunately, or unfortunately, instead of a list of Tita's sins, she heard that the boy was very lonely. The ash-haired girl folded her arms and looked at the boy who was writing something at the table. She asked Edmund again, how could he be alone? The butler just stood quietly, looking at the same point as the girl. The boy seemed to have been given a difficult and overwhelming task. He had been looking at his paper for quite some time, trying to come up with a solution. Then he cleared his throat and began to write something very quickly with his pen. Tita learned to write and read every day from morning until evening. He left the study late, always accompanied by the gentle voice of the butler, saying that the boy tried hard. The estate was cold. Tita nodded and said that he was also grateful to Mr. Edmund for teaching him. The butler also reminded the young man about dinner. Clayt stood behind Edmund all this time and waved her hand to Tita, saying goodbye to him until dinner. The girl couldn't get the butler's words about Tita's loneliness out of her head. She hadn't thought about it before, but now it really seemed to her that the boy was very lonely. She looked at his retreating silhouette. The girl thought about it. She understood perfectly well that for a stable emotional state and a favorable social life, it would be good for him to have a friend. But where would he find friends in the cold and gloomy north? There were no people of Tita's age here, only people of the lower social class, without children, or old people whose years were coming to an end, lived in these lands. The only entertainment here was snow. Tita had no choice but to make an imaginary friend. The witch thought about introducing him to his old grandpas. This seemed more impressive than an imaginary friend. But then she imagined the grandpas playing with him with dolls and snowballs, and she discarded the idea. Then a brilliant idea crept into the girl's head. She quickly walked forward along the corridor. Her eyes were wide open. It seemed that this solution was exactly what she had been looking for so long. Clayt's eyebrows drew together. She remembered that she had someone else and hurried after him. If so, the girl's plan should have worked without fail. The sound of her heels could be heard throughout the entire corridor, and her beautiful ash-blonde hair almost touched the floor. The witch clenched her fist, finally convincing herself that her idea should help Tita cope with loneliness. A bright smile shone on the girl's face. The witch no longer seemed like that cold and heartless lady. Finally reaching her destination, Clayt saw a rather cute puppy sitting on a maroon pillow, shivering from the cold. It was always so cold in this room that even thick fur did not help. This animal was called Canim. If you didn't look closely, it might seem like an ordinary puppy. He even whined like all the other puppies. However, this is a half-breed monster, born from the union of a monster and a wolf. The witch looked at him with affection. She thought that even though he was so tiny now, like a pea, but she heard that when he grew up, he would become bigger than a lion. This fact inspired fear in the girl, so she wanted to see. The girl leaned towards the animal and said that there were no children of Tita's age in Belos, and it was difficult for the young of ordinary animals to survive. The little gray dog sniffed her. He looked so cute and did not look like the offspring of a monster at all. The witch stroked the animal and said that the blood of a monster flows in it, which means that there is no better friend. He will not abandon Tita, even in the most hopeless situation. And he also has some power to protect the crown prince. Nothing could be better. But the girl could not think of what she should say to Tita when she gave it to him. She looked at the puppy sitting in front of her on the table and thought about a very important topic for her. There was a candlestick on the table with a candle smoldering in it. The witch tried to run through all the possible scenarios in her mind and choose an emotion. She could be annoying and say that Tite doesn't have one, or she could be indifferent and say that she picked up a puppy on the way. The choice was very difficult. There was another option, but it was not suitable at all. She was not going to break the comedy and be embarrassed in front of the child. All the options were equally disgusting to her. Cleet lost heart, not knowing how to find an approach to the child. Then her lips spread into a smile. The girl thought that she could just let him hug her, right? She didn't even notice how she started stroking the dog's head. Strangely, it really helped her relieve some stress. Suddenly, the animal's eyes glowed red, and it bared its teeth. The girl quickly removed her hands and asked him to calm down, saying that she would cast a spell on him to prevent the cold. After all, even monsters had it bad in these lands. The flames danced in the lit fireplace, and the brushwood that had recently been added to maintain the heat crackled. It was dark and cold all around, and only this small source of warmth and light saved this eternal winter. The girl cast a spell on the puppy, which enveloped him like a second fur coat. Now he was not as cold as before. He stopped shaking. Cleet asked if there was anything terrible about it, and then she added in a whisper that this pea only had a bad character. The witch breathed a sigh of relief. After all, solving the problem of her newly arrived charge's loneliness wasn't that difficult. All she had to do was unpack the old cabinets and archives and unlock a couple of memories about the puppies. The girl reached out to the animal again. She spoke gently, as if she were guiding a small child on the path of life. Cleet said that the animal's new owner was as lonely as the animal itself. She asked them to live well, relying on each other. The girl peeked around the corner, making sure there was no one in the hallway. She was still a little afraid of Titus, since he was supposed to kill her at the end of the story. In her arms, Cleet held a cute-looking puppy. She was a little surprised that there was no one in the hallway. The girl tensed up, thinking that the boy was already asleep. She stroked the animal's head to relieve the tension. The witch was dressed in a white dress, and a blue-violet gemstone was adorned around her neck. Cleet was confused. She had just been peeking around the corner, as if she was about to do something terrible. What had she been doing? The girl hadn't even done anything bad. Cleet shuddered with tension. Then the girl decided that she needed to quickly give the animal back and go back. She quickened her pace and approached the door. The corridor was dark. Only the dim light of the moon illuminated the room. The witch looked concentrated. She approached the oak double door and knocked twice. She was still overcome with doubts. Was she doing the right thing? No one opened the door. The wait seemed like an eternity. Then she heard footsteps behind the door. As she was about to knock again, already having raised her hand to the door, the girl heard someone ask, "Who is there?" The witch shuddered in surprise. She did not think that the boy would answer so quickly. Cleet pressed the animal closer to herself. Then Tita's voice was heard again. He was asking if it was Mr. Edmund who had come. The girl became even more agitated and turned around. Now she really wanted Edmund to be somewhere nearby. Cleet had forgotten what she was going to say when she handed over the animal. The girl didn't have time to collect her thoughts and simply dropped the animal, winking at him one last time. She said that she was counting on him. Now she got rid of the problem of communication with the boy, and this made her life much easier. Tita went out into the hallway but saw no one there. He looked around again, trying to figure out who had just knocked on his door. Then his gaze fell downwards. There, right under his door, sat an animal. Tita still couldn't figure out who knocked on his door, but now his gaze couldn't tear itself away from the cute little gray ball of fur sitting under his door. The animal was whining, as if asking the boy to take it into the room. It seemed that the puppy was completely frozen. If you think about it, it really was very cold in the estate. Tita's room was the warmest, and therefore, the best solution now would be to take the puppy to yourself and warm it up. Tita picked up the trembling animal and asked where its family was. The boy thought that the poor thing had simply gotten separated from its family and was whining. He could not guess that this cutie was a gift from Cleet for him. Cleet watched the whole thing from around the corner. She heard the boy say that the puppy was so cold. The witch thought that, of course, he would be cold, because she had been hugging him all the time. Tita thought that the animal had been cold all this time and felt sorry for him. Then the boy hugged him, saying that he would keep him warm. If he had nowhere to go, the puppy could stay with him. The boy's eyes filled with light, and the animal licked his cheek and wagged its tail. The girl's plan had worked. Tita continued to say that Her Excellency and Edmund would definitely allow it, and from that moment on, he would become a friend to this puppy. The boy looked very happy, because after a long time, he had a friend. Cleet continued to watch all this from the corner. She was glad that her plan had been successful. The girl watched as Tita took the animal to her room, saying that she would have to give it a name. The girl smiled, thinking that she didn't feel so bad when she saw that he was happy. Watching Tita happy was a pleasure. She breathed a sigh of relief and was about to leave. Her cheeks flushed, and she thought that she had known that children were so incredibly simple. The girl was very happy that Tita liked her gift. Now, according to her plan, he would not be as lonely as before. Then the blush suddenly faded from her face, and it became porcelain again. The girl wondered why she was so happy about this. What was she doing standing there? The smile slowly faded from her face. The girl used her teleportation skill and instantly found herself in the middle of another corridor. She couldn't understand why she was smiling here. There was no way she was going crazy because of a stupid child. The girl needed to pull herself together, and she knew it perfectly well. The room had become cold with the witch's arrival. The girl's hair was fluttering in the light draft created by her teleportation. She tried to justify herself mentally. Cleet justified herself by saying that she did it only to at least slightly reduce the likelihood of Tita going astray. The girl nodded several times, driving the thoughts away and trying to believe in her convictions. The girl imagined the boy sleeping in the arms of his new friend. Surely everything was going according to her plan. Now she was one step closer to not being killed by this boy in the future. The next day, the witch went out for a walk. She and her butler, Edmund, were walking along a snowy path near the estate. The butler asked if Her Excellency had heard the news. The girl asked what the news was. The butler said that the news was that Mr. Tita had suddenly acquired a small puppy. The girl turned away and pretended not to care at all. She said in a detached tone that she thought he had picked it up somewhere. The butler's face lit up with a smile. The man said that he was simply bringing it to her attention so that she would be aware. He went on to say that judging by how suddenly the puppy had appeared, it must have fallen from the sky. Cleet thought that the butler's face had aged greatly, and she had not noticed it before. Walking a little further, Tita appeared before their eyes, walking the dog that, according to Edmund, was a gift from heaven. For some reason, this really infuriated the witch. The boy immediately noticed two people who had just appeared on the horizon. He smiled happily at them and headed in their direction. The animal, the boy's new friend, ran after him like a tail, not lagging behind a single step. He greeted Mr. Edmund and Her Excellency. Edmund also greeted Tita. The boy asked if the two were also out for a walk. The witch did not often leave the estate just to unwind, so her appearance here was a little strange. As soon as Tita came closer to the two people, his dog froze in place and began to growl at Cleet. He immediately tried to calm the puppy, but it was all in vain. The girl looked at the animal with incomprehension in her eyes. While calming the animal, the boy mentioned that the dog's name was Snowball. Edmund was interested in this nickname and asked again, was this really the master's new friend? Is his name Snowball? The boy replied that he named the puppy that because he was white, like snow. The butler smiled again and said that it was a beautiful name. In his opinion, it was perfect for a dog living in an ice castle. But before he could finish his sentence, his speech was interrupted. His gaze fell on the animal again, and the man winced, saying that it couldn't be. His brows immediately drew together, and his face tightened. The butler's pupils narrowed, as if he had just seen something truly horrifying. Sharp fangs were visible in the snow-white puppy's mouth. They were clearly visible as the animal continued to growl at Cleet. Edmund could not be mistaken. This was no ordinary puppy. Those sharp teeth were terrifying. Then the man looked at Snowball's paws, To confirm or disprove his guess, the animal's claws were just as sharp as its teeth. If he wanted, those claws could even tear skin. Edmund turned sharply and looked towards the witch, and she, in turn, also looked away. Tita watched the sudden change of emotions and the situation and was perplexed. Clat thought that this old man was quick-witted, and this was not very good in her current situation. The butler took the girl aside and asked if she could really give His Highness a monster. Cleet replied that they sell many kinds of pets in Belos. To her reproach, the butler again began his fable about how the girl should not have given the child a monster. From their squabble, the two people were pulled out by Tita's voice. The boy said that when he first saw this animal, it was so small and white, just like a real snowball. It seemed that the boy was not in danger from this monster, so Edmund breathed a sigh of relief. The man wiped the sweat from his face and said that he thought that was true. Now that the gentleman had a friend, Tita would no longer be bored. The boy really seemed to blossom with joy and said that he had been playing with snow every day lately. But suddenly, the animal began to show aggression towards the witch again. Snowball bit the hem of her dress and did not want to let go. He was hostile to everyone except his owner. Tita asked the puppy to stop behaving like that. Tita said that he didn't know why the animal was acting like that today, and he was very sorry. The girl frowned and looked down. Thoughts were running through her head that no matter how innocent he was, a monster was still a monster. Or was he angry because of the spell she cast? The witch remembered that Canis had once said that if he chose a master once, he would continue to attack everyone except that one person. Cleet continued to watch as Snowball tried hard to bite off a piece of fabric from her dress. But whatever it was, the girl couldn't understand how some monster could treat her like that. She closed her eyes and exhaled, trying to suppress her aggression and not kill him on the spot. And then she looked at the puppy again. Cleet's eyes reflected the whole range of emotions: anger, aggression, a bit of sadness, and even delight. She mentally said out loud, "That is the guardian of his master." The monster heard what she wanted to tell him. The dog trembled and began to retreat. The sight of this cold witch inspired only fear in the animal. Now, realizing that Cleet was Tita's guardian, the monster gave up trying to attack her and moved away. Surprise and fear were frozen in his eyes. Then the dog curled up into a ball at the feet of its owner. Tita tried to calm his charge, stroking its back and trying to pick it up, but it was of little help. The animal continued to tremble and whine. Tita said that he was usually very quiet, but now he seemed to be scared, seeing so many people. Edmund understood what the boy was getting at and said that it would be necessary to train the puppy little by little, since he was not yet trained at all. Tita looked down again at the trembling Snowball, who seemed to be covering his eyes with his paws in fear, and said that he had never trained animals. The boy needed help in caring for his new friend. Then Edmund, as the best teacher, said that he could help Tita. He said that from today on, the boy could bring him to their lessons. Tita looked at the butler with eyes full of hope and gratitude. Tita smiled and thanked Edmund. Then the teacher remembered that Tita could also go to the library. There were several books there with different ways of raising animals. While they were talking, Clete stood aside and felt out of place. There was a friendly atmosphere between the two that Clete and Tita could not even dream of. It seemed as if the boy and the butler had known each other for a long time. They both smiled as Edmund tried to give Tita a few more tips on how to take care of Snowball. Clete frowned, thinking that Edmund hadn't even done anything. So why did Tita like him so much? And yet it was she who brought the dog, not someone else. She found it very unfair, and she felt hurt in her heart. Edmund said that Snowball was very active, so he needed to be walked as often as possible. Otherwise, he would start gnawing all the furniture in the estate. After all, the butler understood that this was not an ordinary puppy, but an enchanted monster that the witch had given him. Tita immediately confirmed that Snowball did not seem like an ordinary puppy. Despite the fact that the dog was quite small, he was also very strong. Hearing this, Edmund and Clayt were not surprised by such abilities of the puppy, because they knew the truth. The boy was delighted, as it was the first time he saw a dog with sparkling golden eyes. He became even more attached to his new friend, whose gaze now seemed joyful. There was no trace left of the former anger. The witch and the butler exchanged glances. They both knew perfectly well that this was no ordinary dog. Clayt felt somewhat guilty that she had not told the boy the truth and had given him such a dangerous but cute animal. The boy took the puppy in his arms, smiled broadly, and said that he was completely sure that this wonderful white dog with golden eyes, shining like jewels, was given to him by a real angel. When Clayt first heard herself called an angel, she smiled and even felt as if she had wings growing. Everything around her seemed magical and not as gloomy as before. Her soul began to sing. Tita beamed with happiness, thinking that a real angel had given him an animal. And this same angel, in the person of Clayt, was perplexed by what was happening. Even more surprised was the butler, to whom this whole situation seemed impossibly absurd. The young man admitted that, frankly speaking, he was a little lonely in the snowy estate, and now he has a real friend, white as snow, soft and fluffy. Clayt was glad that her plan worked. Tita was sure that angels existed, and one of them knew how lonely and sad he was. That's why he sent him Snowball. The dog yawned in Tita's arms and hugged his owner, and the boy hugged the animal tighter. The boy added that he had even intended to name the puppy Angel from the very beginning. Hearing this, the butler laughed. He hid his face, trying to hold back his laughter. The man did not like such heartfelt stories and did not believe in true friendship. Clayt felt awkward, so she decided to leave quickly. She said that she urgently needed to go to her office, as there were still a couple of unsolved matters. The girl asked Edmund to follow her, as he could accidentally let slip about her involvement in the magical appearance of the animal in the estate. Edmund knew the girl had no unfinished business, and was just about to say so when he felt a stiletto heel prick his foot. The piercing pain in his foot made him suddenly stop talking. Clayt deliberately pricked Edmund with her heel so that he wouldn't blab. She dragged the butler along with her, quickly saying goodbye to the boy. The butler silently followed her, without even saying goodbye to Tita. Edmund decided that now was the best time for jokes, so he asked the witch if she was preparing to become an angel and ascend to heaven without telling him. The girl sharply ordered him to shut up, as she did not like the joke. But the butler did not calm down. He said that God would clearly not appreciate her magical transformation from a witch to an angel. Edmund continued to smile maliciously. Then the girl with a cold voice replied that she would sew his mouth shut if he continued to mock her. Edmund asked if Mr. Tita knew that his beloved puppy was a half-breed with a touch of monster in it. Clayt was no fool, so she obviously didn't tell the boy about his new friend's dark side. It was a secret. The girl looked away and asked the butler not to tell the boy about it yet. She was afraid that Tita would be scared, and he had only just stopped thinking that he could be turned into a frog. The boy could feel deceived. Clayt assured the butler that there was nothing to be afraid of, since Canis had said that if he was trained well, he would become even more obedient than an ordinary dog, so there was nothing to worry about. Edmund liked this answer and agreed. They turned around when they heard Tita call his dog. The boy's voice sounded happy and excited. He liked playing with Snowball and was ready to spend all his free time with his pet. Tita threw a bone to Snowball, who caught it and brought it back to his master. They played Carefree in the park, while Clayt and the butler watched. The boy and the animal got along well and were happy. During the game, Snowball jumped so high that he was able to snatch the bone from his master's hands with great force. Tita was surprised by this, as he did not expect the puppy to jump so high. He cried out in surprise. Snowball began to run away quickly, having got the bone. The boy ran after him, shouting that it was not allowed to eat it, as it was just a toy. But the animal did not pay attention to the shouts of its owner. Edmund, who was watching the chase from the side, continued to laugh. The situation was really funny. Cleet's eyes were full of joy, and her usually cold face was frozen in a slight smile. The boy and Snowball were so funny that they could make anyone laugh. Joy, warmth, and friendship began to spread throughout the cold castle. Cleet said that she felt this good energy. Everything around seemed to be waking up from a long sleep, permafrost, and darkness. Tita finally caught up with the dog, picked him up, and started explaining to his pet that he shouldn't run away. The puppy was holding the bone in his teeth, not wanting to let go and trying to break free. Tita noticed that Snowball was covered in drool, and he thought it was funny. The boy decided to teach Snowball commands every day. He threw a bone to the puppy, and according to the rules of their game, Snowball had to catch it and bring it back to his owner's hands. Snowball really liked this game. He happily jumped around. One morning, Clete called the butler to her home to give him an errand. Edmund was always ready to fulfill any whim of the mistress. He was a faithful butler, so the witch could count on him in a variety of situations. The girl turned to the door, where the butler stood, and said that the daughter of the head of the Tita clan was ill and needed help. Edmund tried to remember some information about the Tita clan. He knew little. After thinking for a moment, the man remembered that the Ket clan was a family of fox guardians. They lived in a village located in the territory, under the control of Clut. Now it became clear to Edmund where he would need to go. Clete continued reading the letter she had just received. It said that the girl's life was not in danger, but it seemed that the illness was very serious, and the daughter of the head of the Ket clan needed help. The butler sighed. He did not really want to go so far. Clete handed him a bag of herbs and potions for the sick girl. It was quite heavy. The man was ready to set out, but before leaving, he asked again if he should set out alone. Clete replied that she had a lot to do, so the butler would have to go alone. To get from the ice castle to the village of Tita, you need to walk for 3 days, but if you use the teleport, you can get there in an instant. The girl finally ordered him to stay there for a day and watch what was happening. She asked if Edmund was ready to set out. The man with the backpack on his shoulders said that he was ready to go to the lands of Ket immediately. After the butler said he was ready to leave right away, the girl noticed something strange in the butler's hands. It was a teleportation scroll. With it, he would be at the house of the head of the Tita clan in a second. Clete told him to leave the teleportation scroll. The butler looked at the girl with bewilderment and tightened his grip on the scroll, not wanting to leave it. He did not understand why he could not use magic. Clete replied that she wanted him to return as late as possible. She added that it would be better if he stayed to live there. The man was upset by her words. He asked who would take care of her if he was gone. The witch realized that she would have to be content with only 1 day of vacation. Edmund was afraid to leave the estate in such unreliable hands. A witch, a baby, and a monster. It seemed like a bad combo to him. He asked the girl to live in peace with His Highness until he returned. It was the old man's small wish. He was especially worried about leaving Mr. Tita in the care of a witch. His face turned gloomy just thinking about it. The girl said that she understood everything and would take good care of the baby and his dog. The butler tried to object. He remembered that he had promised to have lunch with Mr. Tita. But before he could finish his thought, Clete teleported him away. The girl did not want to listen to what he was saying. The room was filled with silence, as the butler's strength vanished into thin air. Now the old man was somewhere on the other side of the Clete lands, with a bag of medicine in his backpack. Teleportation was very convenient after all. The witch sighed with relief and smiled. She said that it was much better and quieter now. The girl remembered that at the end he wanted to say something, but she did not think it was something important. Having dealt with one problem, the witch decided to head to the research lab to work on new potion recipes there. She also used teleportation, and a moment later, her silhouette disappeared into thin air. She felt confident in the laboratory. The girl liked developing new potions and medicines. Therefore, she diligently set to work. collected everything necessary to implement her new idea. She had something prepared for this day. The girl had waited so long for Edmund to leave the estate to begin a new experiment. In her hands were scrolls, a box, and several flasks with multicolored liquids. Today, she was going to enjoy creating dangerous magical items that she couldn't do because she was worried about the old man's reaction. She had plenty of time for this work, and she knew for sure that no one would interfere with her. She laid out her chosen ingredients on her table: dangerous potions and reagents, herbal tinctures and crystals, toad legs and magical attributes. All of this needed to be mixed together to create something truly deadly. The witch's soul rejoiced. Finally, she could do her favorite thing. The girl was waiting for this day, so much that she didn't even know where to start. She had a lot of different ideas in her head that she wanted to implement. She had already come up with a new recipe for the potion when a thought flashed through her head that Edmund had asked her to look after Tita and live with him amicably until his arrival. The man asked her not to leave the boy alone for long. She was distracted from her work and decided to follow the butler's request to go check on her ward. The girl left all the reagents and scrolls on the table and decided that she would still have time to come up with some new dangerous recipe, but only after she made sure that Tita was okay. After all, in her mind, if you leave a child for a long time, he can create unnecessary problems. For example, break things dear to her, or even destroy half the castle. After all, children are so restless, they love to play pranks and make a mess. And as much as she didn't want to continue her work in the lab, the girl decided to go and watch the baby so that he wouldn't harm himself or the interior of the estate. And she went in search of Tita. The girl instantly teleported to where Tita was. She was still going to fulfill the butler's request. The boy was stunned when he saw the witch appear out of nowhere. He was holding a puppy in his arms. Then Clayt came closer to Tita. Now she noticed that the little boy looked a little worried and sad. He asked if she knew where Mr. Edmund was now. It seemed that the boy was worried about the fate of the butler. The witch did not expect the young master to be so worried about the butler. She was confused. Cleet coldly replied that Edmund had gone to Kita village on an errand and would not be back today. Tita's expression sank, and he looked even sadder than before. The boy said that Edmund had promised to cook something tasty for dinner today. It seemed to be very important to the little gentleman. Cleet frowned. She couldn't understand why Tita disliked her so much, but now it seemed to her that it was because he was more attached to the butler. The girl also thought that it was just dinner. She could cook it too. Tita turned and slowly trudged towards the exit of their room. He stroked Snowball and said that they would most likely have to dine together today. The dog barked affirmatively, but as soon as he touched the door handle, Cleet called out to the boy. The young man looked at the girl in surprise, and she cleared her throat as if trying to find the right words. She wanted to prove to him that she was no worse than Edmund. A new plan was maturing in the witch's head. Silence hung in the room. Then she managed to squeeze out a few words. Cleet called the boy to come with her, as she had some business in the kitchen. In fact, she had no business. She was just going to share a meal with Tita instead of Edmund. The girl was completely focused on the fact that she had to surpass the butler. She walked forward very quickly. The boy could hardly keep up with her. The girl thought that she could prove that she could also look after the boy well. A few minutes later, everything was ready. They were sitting in a spacious room at the dining table. On the table were various delicacies and drinks, all of which the girl, of course, created with the help of magic. She sat, propping her head up with her hand and looking at Tita. Clayt was so determined to beat Edmund in this babysitting competition that she even put in a little more effort than she had originally planned. The girl carefully laid out all the dishes, and the room was filled with a pleasant aroma. She told the boy to eat more. Her soul was glad, because Edmund had prepared several dishes in advance. All she had to do was put everything on the table. Tita loudly wished him a bon appetit and took the cutlery in his hands. The boy began to eat. He obviously liked the taste of the food, as he ate very quickly. Cleet could only look at the happy child sitting in front of her now. The girl involuntarily remembered that this man should kill her in the future. Snowball wasn't left without food either. On the floor under the table was a bowl with his name on it, and in it was a large amount of dog food. The dog was wagging his tail, happy with such an abundance of food. Everyone in this room was happy to some extent. The witch continued to look at the boy, and then realized that it was also not possible to eat too quickly. The girl said that Tita was eating so quickly, as if he had been starving for 3 days. She was a little embarrassed to see such a picture, but the girl liked that the boy looked happy. Tita, hearing these words, sank. He began to eat much more slowly, and stammered that he had slept too long, so he could not have breakfast. The boy apologized for his behavior at the table, sincerely believing that he had done something wrong. Cleet didn't think her words would be taken that way. The girl didn't want to offend the boy. She just didn't want him to choke on his food, but she couldn't add anything. The witch could only reproach herself for the incorrectly formulated sentence. After a short silence, the girl finally said that he had nothing to apologize for. And anyway, why did this boy always apologize? She told him to continue eating, to which Tita nodded, but his face did not express the same happiness and delight. The boy continued eating at the same pace, and from time to time, he glanced at the witch. He asked her why she wasn't eating, but really, he had never seen her eat anything. Even Snowball had already eaten, so why hadn't she put a crumb in her mouth? The girl cast her magic on a jug of water and lifted it into the air with ease, just by waving her hand. She said that witches don't have to eat. Tita was surprised to hear this. He had never thought about this peculiarity of witches. Cleet said that there was nothing surprising about that. She levitated a glass that stood near the boy and filled it with water from a jug using magic. The girl added that he should not think about it, but rather eat it himself. The boy fidgeted in his chair and hesitantly agreed. The witch noticed that Tita had slowed down his eating again. After her words, the boy seemed afraid to eat as fast as before. She frowned and told him to eat as fast as before. Snowball, meanwhile, was gnawing on something on the floor. Tita reminded the witch that she had business in the dining room. She looked at Tita without looking away. Hearing his question, Cleet replied that she was currently doing just that. The boy was again perplexed. How could she solve her own problems if she was sitting here and watching him eat? But she did not respond to his grimace. When the meal was over, the young gentleman washed down everything he had eaten with a glass of water and expressed his gratitude for the food. He was very glad that he did not have to dine alone. Then Cleet and Tita left the dining hall. The boy bowed to her and said that he would return to his room. The witch agreed with this. Now she was completely calm about the baby. He was fed and well fed, which meant that he should not cause problems. But something was bothering her. They said goodbye, but the girl decided to follow him to his room. She didn't hide and simply followed the boy. At first, he didn't turn around, but he understood perfectly well that the girl was accompanying him. Then Tita got a little fed up and turned around. The witch froze. This action seemed to her the best solution. It seemed she wanted to believe that Tita was completely blind and could confuse her with a statue. There was a deathly silence. It worked the first time. The boy continued walking without asking any questions, but he picked up the pace. He was scared. He was still afraid of the witch. The girl also picked up the pace, keeping a little distance from him. Then, realizing that the plan with acceleration did not work, the boy switched to running. He ran as fast as he could. But the witch used some kind of spell, so she did not make any effort to chase him. The girl did not understand that he was running away from her. Quite exhausted and covered in cold sweat, the boy decided to turn around and ask Cleet directly. Tita asked if the girl was following him. The witch was not tired at all. Her face remained as pale. She answered that everything was exactly like that. Then Tita asked a completely logical question again. The boy asked why she was following him. Cleet answered that she was doing it only so that he would not get into trouble along the way. Tita sincerely did not understand what kind of trouble there could be in this ice castle. He looked at the girl with a puzzled expression. After a short silence, the boy assured her that he was not going to look for trouble, but would just play quietly. To which the witch said that she had to keep an eye on him. He shuddered when he heard the words about surveillance. Tita asked again, "Does that mean the witch will go with him all the way to the entrance to his room?" The girl replied that it goes without saying. She herself did not understand why she was doing this, but it seemed to her that it would be more correct. Everything he is a child. Cleet thought that she would have to check in the morning how this boy usually played. When the morning came, she came to his room and closely watched every action of the boy. Her gaze became uncomfortable. The girl lay down on the bed, telling him to ignore her and play as usual. She herself didn't particularly like the idea of being watched. But what wouldn't you do at Edmund's request? Tita couldn't play calmly under such a close gaze, so all he could do was sit silently. He was very worried. The boy said in a trembling voice that he was just playing with dolls. Cleet replied that he should play as usual. She would not disturb him, but would just watch. The only thing Tita wanted now was to throw this witch out the door. The boy took the dog in his arms and said, addressing the puppy, that he would be for Mr. Edmund and Snowball would be Her Excellency. He justified this by saying that Snowball was white, just like the girl. Tita was very worried. Then the boy took Snowball's paw in his hand and picked up one of the dolls lying on the floor. He said that this doll was him. The plush doll was dressed in a green dress, and its eyes were made of buttons. The witch, watching the game, was puzzled. She expected anything, but she did not expect Tita to play with dolls with them. In his game there are roles of Edmund, Clete, and himself. This was a little strange for her. Tita began to speak. He was now in the role of Edmund. The boy brought his doll and the puppy that played the role of Clete to the other and asked Her Excellency to take care of the young master. Everything was just like in real life, only with dolls. But then, something went wrong. The puppy pounced on the doll that represented Tita and tore it apart with its teeth. It was somewhat similar to their relationship in a past life. Those times when Clete couldn't stand this little guy. But now, everything was completely different. The boy asked the puppy how he could tear this doll apart so mercilessly. After all, in that case, Tita would die in this game. Clete jumped up from her bed, screaming to stop the game. She asked loudly, "What just happened?" Tita replied that he was just playing with dolls. He felt guilty that she had to see this scene. The girl pointed to the torn doll and added that she meant it. She clearly did not like the way things were going. Clete's face darkened, and her voice was filled with hidden malice. Just this tone made the boy tremble. The girl asked if he really dared to give her role to a dog who did not understand human language. Now Tita felt even more guilty. The boy began to apologize. It seemed like the stream of apologies would go on forever, but Clete snatched the doll from Tita's hands. It was abrupt and not a very well thought-out decision. The boy expected the witch to hate him after that, but then the girl calmed down. With the help of magic, she patched up the torn doll, sat down next to Tita, and said that she would play for herself, and he would be Edmund. The young man nodded in agreement. Then she added that Snowball was him, and this doll would play the role of Snowball. In the end, according to her rules, the list of roles was as follows. Clete played herself, Tita played Edmund, Snowball played Tita, and the doll was Snowball. Everything was impossibly simple and as honest as possible. At least, that's how it seemed to her. Tita could not get used to the fact that he was playing with dolls, not alone, but with someone. He, stuttering, said, turning to Snowball, that Her Excellency was coming to see Mr. Tita. The girl interrupted him and asked where he had seen such stuttering butlers. She advised him to speak clearly and concisely. The boy's eyes filled with tears. He sobbed and apologized endlessly again. Tita said that he had done wrong. Clete tried to somehow diffuse the situation, but made it worse by saying that he should stop apologizing, because if people from her family were pathetic, her authority would fall. So they started the game again. Tita again assumed the role of the butler and turned to Snowball. He told Mr. Tita that Her Excellency was coming and that he should quickly go and embrace her. Snowball did not want to get up from his place and play his role. The boy tried to persuade the dog to come to Cleet, saying that Her Excellency was not at all scary. She would hug him tenderly. The girl crossed her arms over her chest and exhaled, thinking that this was better. Tita, as Edmund told Snowball to hug his mistress quickly, and brought the puppy to Cleet's face. They had a tense relationship ever since the girl cast a spell on him and brought him to the boy under the door of the room. Snowball bared his teeth at her. His fangs were flashing, and there was only anger in his eyes. This dog clearly had no intention of playing his role. The girl was not afraid of him, but rather found it funny. She could not find the words to respond to this situation. Then her expression changed abruptly, frowning and shaking with anger. She asked herself, how dare this puppy address her like that? They were opposite each other and glared at each other. Tita didn't see the grimace that Snowball was making. The boy could only see the anger in the girl's eyes as she looked at his best friend. He asked what happened. Tita's eyes reflected light and positivity. The girl didn't want to ruin it. The girl picked up Snowball in her arms, addressing him as Tita. She said that she was not scary at all and hugged the dog. He tried to break free and protested vigorously for giving such actions towards him. He did not like this cold lady. She brought him closer to her and repeated again that there was no need to be afraid of her. The puppy tried to break free with effort, leaning his paws on her face and preventing her from speaking normally. The girl whispered that it would be better for him to be quieter while she spoke nicely. Snowball was scared by this and decided to get into character before it was too late. He trembled and whined, afraid of this scary woman. And Tita was delighted by how quickly Cleet and the puppy found a common language. The boy in the butler's troop praised Mr. Tita and clapped his hands. He seemed to enjoy playing like this. At first, he thought that it couldn't be fun with Cleet, but now his world seemed to have turned upside down. The boy continued. He said that he was right about Her Excellency being very affectionate, and that he was very glad that Tita had become close to her. The girl smiled lightly, and her cheeks became slightly flushed. But then something happened that she had not expected at all. The boy said that Mr. Tita was fine, that Her Excellency had hugged him so tenderly, but that he was not Mr. Tita, so he could only look at her. She did not understand what this boy was trying to do. Tita stared at Snowball, saying that he must be so happy now. The witch still couldn't figure out what kind of face he was making now. There was almost no emotion on the boy's face. He looked at the puppy with an empty gaze and said nothing more. Then Cleet realized what was happening. She had previously thought that the boy had completely immersed himself in the role of Edmund, but it turned out that he was stuck on Snowball. The girl felt like an extra in their game. She once again followed Tita's gaze and realized that he was not taking his eyes off the puppy. The witch decided it was time to put the roles back on track. She cleared her throat and turned to Edmund, who was playing Tita. The boy instantly remembered that he was Mr. Edmund and responded to Her Excellency's call. Cleet said that he had been looking after Tita well lately and helping him with his studies. She was very happy about this, so she added that he could wish for anything and she would reward him with it. The boy asked again if he had heard everything correctly. He could not believe that it was true. The girl assured him that she was not lying. She stroked Snowball, who was already peacefully lying on her lap and no longer trying to escape. The boy shifted again, lost in thought. He didn't want much, but he couldn't think of anything to wish for. He had already collected his thoughts, but he couldn't find the right words. Tita began to say what he would want in that case. He looked away and asked to hug him too. Tita understood that he was now in the role of a butler, and Cleet most likely would not want to hug a butler, but he would probably try. It was worth it. The boy's eyes filled with hope. The girl expected this, but as soon as she heard the voiced request, she began to doubt her abilities. After all, saying that she would do anything was a mistake. Her face changed abruptly. Cleet justified her reluctance to hug anyone by saying that no master would hug his butler. But it was a simple game, and perhaps she should have listened to the boy's request. Tita sank. The joy on his face suddenly disappeared, as if it had never been there. Noticing this change in mood, the girl thought over her words again, cleared her throat, and said that, however, she could make an exception. Cleet said that since he was a real butler, she could make only one exception and hug him just this once. The boy raised his head sharply, and hope shone in his eyes again. In fact, he had never thought that Cleet would agree to this. He suddenly threw himself into the arms of the mistress, thanking her for allowing him to hug her. Tita looked joyful. Such a bright smile seemed to shine on his face for the first time. The girl did not think that he would hug her so suddenly, so she was a little scared. Tita hugged her tighter. Only then did Cleet come to her senses and understand what was happening. She was very happy that the boy asked her permission, and she was even happier that they were finally finding a common language. The witch didn't know what she should do in this situation. She hesitated for a long time, whether to hug him back or just leave it like that. In fact, she had already fulfilled her promise, and her conscience was clearer than ever. After some time, she put her hand on his back and lightly stroked the boy. She understood that even if he didn't say it, he most likely missed the warm embrace very much. Cleet never imagined that she would hug the man who would kill her in the future. They sat on the floor in Tita's room and hugged. This hug seemed long. Cleet did not like such things, but for the sake of Tita and her own survival, she was ready to sit like that for at least an hour, at least 2. Having received his, the boy stepped back and said with a smile on his face that it was much more interesting to play with dolls with Her Excellency than alone or with Edmund. The girl did not expect to hear this, but was pleasantly surprised. He then turned to Snowball, asking him if Mr. Tite had enjoyed playing with Cleet. The puppy growled something, looking less than thrilled and happy that the witch was now in the same room with him. Snowball barked something. There was a hint of aggression in his bark, but Tita said that he liked playing with them too. Cleet thought exactly the opposite. She was sure that even a fool could understand that the dog had answered no. There was a sweet atmosphere between Tita and Snowy again, and Cleet felt like an outsider again. The two really did look like friends. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she was glad that her plan with the puppy as a gift had worked. The boy looked happy. He was sitting on the witch's lap, holding a puppy in his arms. Cleet gloated, mentally lamenting that she, too, knew how to babysit. She was glad that she had managed to wipe Edmund's nose. 3 hours passed, and the boy continued to play. The witch was already quite exhausted from this game with dolls, and there were circles under her eyes. She no longer smiled. She had no strength at all. For 3 long hours, she listened to Tita's babble every now and then. The girl did not understand how the boy himself did not get tired of playing after such a long time. And how did this child even contain so much energy? The witch looked at the happy baby and thought only about how tired she was. Cleet looked at Tita and suggested that they play something else. The boy smiled broadly and asked what they could play. He was ready for something new, as long as Cleet sat with him. After a short silence, as if thinking, the girl said that they would play doing nothing. The boy was delighted. He had never heard of such a game and was interested in what it was, and Cleet just wanted to relax. The witch began to explain the rules. Her game was to lie down together on the bed and not move. The one who moved first lost. She also said that this was a traditional game of bellows. She could finally breathe out. The girl could not believe that playing with children was so tiring. Now she could rest a little, but as soon as she thought about rest, she heard Tita calling her. The girl raised an eyebrow, but did not open her eyes, much less get out of bed. She simply asked what he wanted. Cleet wanted to believe that Tita would agree to play this a little longer, so that she could rest some more. The boy asked if it was allowed to talk, according to the rules of this game. The girl answered that this was also strictly forbidden, but since he did not know this yet, she would forgive him this time, and would not count him as a loser. Tita replied that he understood everything. But the girl immediately interrupted him, saying that he couldn't answer either. Now they lay motionless on the bed, in complete silence. Cleet felt like she was so tired of playing that she was about to die. But as soon as everyone fell silent, Snowball spoke up. Tita immediately stated that Snowball was in last place. Cleet said that Tita had also spoken up, and the boy, in turn, replied that the girl had also stopped being silent. The girl said that she hadn't said anything. She had simply stated the fact, so that Tita would know that he had lost. The boy immediately realized, and replied that he had only said that because he thought Snowball wouldn't guess. Then he added that since it was a draw, it would be nice to play something else. Suddenly, the butler burst into the room. He greeted his mistress loudly and walked quickly towards her. "Your Excellency, did you have a good day yesterday? You didn't make Mr. Tita cry, did you?" he asked cautiously. The lady looked at him with displeasure. "Is this the first thing you tell me after your return? It seems you had a good vacation," the girl said, examining the man with her eyes. Around his neck was a necklace of bright summer flowers, and he himself was holding 3 backpacks, 2 in his hands and 1 on his back. "Tita is doing great. He ate well and didn't cry at all," the blonde witch said, emotionlessly. Sadly remembering yesterday, she thought. "After all, the only one who wanted to cry was me." The old man frowned incredulously in response. He clearly doubted the blonde witch's words. He looked up at the ceiling, wondering about the lady's possible behavior. The girl exclaimed in response, "What kind of distrustful face is this?" The butler quickly left the room, and the girl followed him. He could not believe the words of Her Excellency, so of course he must see it with his own eyes. The man spoke. The witch, barely keeping up with him, answered that he should do whatever his heart desired. The man knocked loudly on the door. When he opened it, he saw a sunlit room. The red-crimson curtains were already open, and then the butler turned to the little boy, who was still sleeping in the bed. "Please forgive me, Mr. Tita," barely blinked and rose from the pillows, but still under the blanket. Then, rubbing his eyes, he greeted the butler and Her Excellency in a sleepy voice. He was very glad to see Edmund. Walking quickly up to the boy, the butler quickly bowed and then apologized. "I apologize for calling so early. I was just wondering if you had a good day yesterday. Her Excellency didn't leave you alone all day or anything, did she?" the man asked, smiling affectionately. The boy smiled shyly and then answered the worried Mr. Edmund. "No, it was very fun," he exclaimed. "Her Excellency and I were playing with dolls, and she told me about a new game." "A new game?" the old man asked, surprised. The blonde witch, who had been a silent witness to the dialogue, awkwardly stepped aside. Then the boy finally answered, "Yes, it's called nothing, not doing. Do you know it too, Edmund?" Mr. Edmund quickly turned to the Snow Lady and asked in a dissatisfied voice, "Doing nothing, is that really what it's called?" The girl was already anticipating the butler's moralizing, and therefore thought doomedly, "Damn, why did Tita start talking about her? You have to lie down on the bed, and you mustn't move under any circumstances. It's a traditional game of bellows," said the little prince, glancing at his pet, who was sleepily stretching on the pillow next to his master. "It seems like a very boring game." "No, it's very relaxing," said the butler. "How did you sleep?" Edmund asked, sitting on the bed. "There was a strong wind yesterday. Were you sure you slept well?" the man asked in a worried voice. "Stretching," the boy answered. "Yes, Her Excellency put me to bed." The elderly butler turned his satisfied gaze to the fair-haired girl. "Is that so?" he asked thoughtfully, glancing sideways at her. Her Excellency blushed from the servant's direct and intrusive gaze. As he left the room, Mr. Edmund addressed the young gentleman for the last time. "I am glad you slept well, Mr. Tita. Well, I will see you at breakfast." The little prince responded with a joyful exclamation. "Aha! I will see you soon, Mr. Edmund. And with you, Your Excellency." Walking down the corridor, the butler turned to the lady. "Your Excellency, you look after the children better than I expected, although it would have been much better without that terrible game." The girl answered him in an irritated voice. Shut up, I had no other choice. And yet, now that we have learned your abilities, we can leave Mr. Tita in your care from time to time. The butler spoke slyly. The blonde shuddered at such impudence and exclaimed loudly, What? No way, I won't survive a second time. Do you even know how boring it was and how tired I am? Without rushing to answer, the man moved a few steps away from the lady, and only then, chuckling, answered, And yet, I'm glad that you two seem to have become a little closer to each other. The girl rolled her eyes and then asked, What's the difference? Recalling the recent incident, the blonde witch asked, By the way, how is the daughter of the head of the Keta clan? The man, who did not expect such a question, was a little surprised, but quickly answered, She is recovering. She just needs to rest well and eat well for a few days, and then she will recover. Therefore, the chief said that as a token of gratitude, he would increase the tribute for a while. The butler continued his own conclusion. How could church rats like them increase the tribute? The lady asked discontentedly. She turned away from the man and walked quickly, walking further and further away from Mr. Edmund. The lady said irritably, Tell them that this is unnecessary. And then the butler, recently struck by the rudeness of the lady, smiled brightly. Then he put his palm to his chest and bowed. Yes, good. After that day, I never had the chance to look after Tita alone. The blonde witch thought as she read another novel. Next to her, as usual, the fireplace was burning brightly. It always warmed and calmed her, no matter how cold it was. And of course, we didn't play with dolls anymore, but she always remembered his childish, cheerful, and mischievous laughter. This little unwanted guest was still too annoying and inconvenient, the girl thought. On such cold evenings, they both warmed themselves by the burning fireplace. The little prince, clutching his beloved pet in his arms, laughed heartily, and the girl on the armchair only watched him with a weak smile, clutching a book in her hands. But at some point, I began to get used to these feelings, the lady thought. One cold day, the golden-haired boy decided to go for a walk. He slowly walked between the slopes of tall birches, carefully examining each tree. Suddenly, the silhouette of a blonde appeared from the horizon. The boy was surprised, but still very happy to see his snow lady. He smiled brightly and waved his hand vigorously. Hello, Your Excellency, the little prince said cordially, addressing the lady. Suddenly, the pet quickly ran away from the girl. Tita only exclaimed, Ah, Snowball, run slower. Not fully understanding what was happening, the blonde witch watched her adopted son in surprise. Smiling cordially, Her Excellency watched the frisky silhouettes recede. Looking at this painfully funny picture, the girl thought, I am sure of only one thing. Our relationship was definitely different from what it was in the past. Slowly descending the wooden stairs, the golden-haired baby stomped quite loudly, but his ringing childish voice was heard even louder. Let's go quickly, Snowball, he called his beloved pet. He looked at the dog in surprise. Taking the leash in his hands, the little prince came closer to him. Snowball was very active today. He was happily looking with his tail and barking loudly. Snowball, I think. The boy paused for a moment, preferring to check his guesses once again. He examined his pet once more, and the little boy came to the same conclusion. Snowball, it seems you've suddenly become even bigger. The dog didn't look like a little puppy anymore. Why are you growing so fast? The boy asked rhetorically, putting a leash on him. Maybe you're eating something in secret from me. The golden-haired prince asked again. But suddenly the dog almost jumped on him, starting to lick his entire face. The baby exclaimed, It tickles. He tried to push Snowball away. Okay, I get it. You don't want to hear this, do you? Let's go quickly, said the little prince, pushing Snowball away from him. He turned sharply, heading outside into the garden, leading the little dog behind him. It was late. Although it was not yet time to go to bed, it was already getting dark. In the garden where Tita was heading, there were fountains and neatly trimmed flowers. It was amazing that they always maintained the beauty of the garden, even in the bitter frost. Blue, lush roses were planted all over the garden. They bloomed brightly, even in winter, even at night without light. It seemed that they would be the only thing that could survive forever. Perhaps it is because of their thorns that do not allow strangers to approach them, or perhaps because of those who tenderly care for them. "Snowball, did you hear?" Mr. Edmund said. "We can't go out tonight." The boy panted, barely keeping up with his very fast dog. But even at their speed, they were still not halfway across the garden. Lost in thought, the little youth muttered under his breath, "Didn't he say that this was the night of the rising of the mocking moon? He ordered that I be sure to return to the room before sunset." The boy repeated his moral teachings to himself. "So we must have a walk now." The little prince's monologue was interrupted by the loud barking of a dog. Snowball's muzzle was directed at the blue rose bushes. Then the boy also turned his gaze to them. He was noticeably surprised by them. He squatted down, calling the dog closer to him. Hugging his pet, the golden-haired baby began to admire the flowers. "Wow, how beautiful, right? A snowball?" the boy barely audibly said. The pet only sniffed the bush suspiciously a few times. "Blue roses," thought the golden-haired little prince, looking at the flower, enchanted. It seemed that it even shone, shimmering and bathing in the sun's rays of light. So beautiful was the bush of blue flowers that it was beautiful even in the harsh winter. He remembered her. He remembered her skin, her eyes, her look, her hair. And then the prince understood what it was about such an unusual flower that had caught his attention. Their color was similar to the eyes of Her Excellency, the little boy thought. Then he reached for a bush of the most beautiful blue flowers. He wanted to drown in their color and not breathe. He carefully touched the leaves, afraid that he might hurt them, or that a beautiful leaf would fall off. And this was the prince's beautiful mistake. Deceived by the charming beauty of the flower, he forgot how dangerous the thorns that the rose had grown for protection could be. And no matter how beautiful they were, his hand was burned with pain. The pet only whined, stretching out its paw to the owner's wound. The boy said, "It hurts. I think I cut myself on a thorn." He looked at his finger, which was slightly injured. Blood was trickling from it in a thin stream. Looking at the sky, the little prince realized that it was time to go back. A little more, and the long night would come. And he did not want to disappoint Mr. Edmund. "It was already a little dark, so let's go back." He addressed his pet softly. The red-eyed boy turned his head and looked high into the sky. His pet followed his example and looked up wearily. The boy was very surprised, but at first he himself did not believe what he saw. "The moon is already out," the little golden-haired boy exclaimed loudly, trembling at the sight of the full moon in the dark night sky. The moon brightly illuminated the street. The roses reflected its light. Only the prince looked at it in shock. "We just left the castle. How could it be so dark already?" the little boy exclaimed in confusion. Meanwhile, the rose that was sprinkled with drops of his blood suddenly lit up with red, crimson magic. It enveloped the entire flower. "Anyway, let's get back here soon, Snowball." The boy was so nervous that he almost screamed, but his pet only growled. For a moment, the prince thought that Snowball's eyes lit up. He couldn't tell if it was real or just the effect of adrenaline in his blood. What are you doing all of a sudden?" the boy asked the dog in a trembling voice, bending down to her on his haunches. Behind him, the blue cold rose was blazing up more and more. The red magic around it really did look like tongues of fire. "Snowball, stop it," the kid said in a more dissatisfied voice. He held his pet tightly with one hand, stroking him with the other. "No, there is no time for this now," the boy exclaimed, almost begging Snowball to stop. "We need to get back before it gets any darker." He continued his moralizing golden-haired little prince. Suddenly, behind him, from the rose bushes, a huge female silhouette emerged. He awkwardly addressed the boy. "Tita." The boy watched the girl standing in front of him, fascinated. He didn't dare move or take his eyes off her, afraid that she would disappear, vanish, leave, and leave him here alone in this crazy full moon. "Your Excellency," he said it, barely audible, not believing his own eyes, so that only this girl could hear. In front of him stood the same Cleet, just more frank and open. "That's right, Tita. It's me," the blonde spoke in her seductive, enticing voice. "Don't be afraid. Come to me." The blonde witch, who seemed to float in the air, said, "Don't be afraid. Come here." Her eyes shone in the darkness of the night, and the wind blew waves of her snow-white hair. She was wearing an open red dress that fit her figure perfectly, stretching out both hands to the baby. The snow-white lady, as if choking, said in a thin voice, "That's it, Tita. Hurry." The boy stood in complete confusion. He was haunted by a strange, unpleasant premonition. But the heart won over the mind. The prince saw her appearance. He trusted Her Excellency. She can't deceive him, can she? No, no. Her Excellency is good, the boy thought. Suddenly he tore from his place and ran up to the lady. The little golden-haired baby grabbed the fair-haired witch tightly. He was afraid that it was just a mirage, a deception, and the strange premonition still did not leave him. But as soon as he touched her lightly, his palm burned with pain. "It's icy, it's cold," the boy exclaimed loudly. He began to tremble all over and closed his eyes in pain. His palm ached unpleasantly, and there was no way to warm it up because they were still outside. The girl responded by simply placing her index finger on the lips of the small, dissatisfied prince. "Everything is fine," the witch whispered to the very young boy. The boy's legs began to tremble slightly, either from excitement or from the cold. With a sharp movement, the fair-haired beauty pressed the golden-haired baby tyrant to herself. She hugged him tightly, stroking his head and shoulders. Then she said soothingly, "Don't be afraid, I'm right here." The boy looked at her in surprise, not understanding what was happening. "It's become warm," the prince thought, pressing himself closer to the lady. After a while, he asked a question to somehow calm his inner anxiety. "Your Excellency, how did you know where I was? Were you out for a walk, just like me?" "All because you called me," the girl answered, smiling happily, looking into the child's face. Then he noticed the difference. Her eyes were lighter. They were so sunny. Her Excellency does not have such. But maybe it is just the nightlight that reflects in her eyes, and she is simply happy to be with me, he thought. "Me?" the little prince asked again. "Yes, you lured me with your blood," the witch answered indifferently, still holding the boy tightly. "Blood?" Titus asked again, frightened. "What does that mean?" he asked, not understanding. "But I don't quite understand what you mean," the boy quietly admitted, whispering in his mistress's ear. "You must have been very lonely, poor little one," the blonde girl whispered. The boy was very surprised when he realized how Cleet could see the whole situation, even looking into his soul. He remembered those special long evenings when he could only watch the snowstorm outside the window. The fireplace was burning in the room, but despite this, the prince was very cold. A strange feeling settled in his chest and made her languish. The little prince instantly felt pain and loneliness again. But this time the spasms were right in his chest. Tears began to gather in his eyes, and he himself only sniffled. It was not clear whether from the cold or from the tears that were coming. "Now I will always be by your side, so that you do not feel lonely." The blonde witch spoke softly, hugging the boy. Seeing the doubt on the prince's face, she added, "Really?" It suddenly started snowing outside. It became much colder. The little golden-haired baby cried even harder. The lady said, "Of course, I never lie," burying his face even more deeply in the fair-haired girl's collarbones. The boy said, "I am truly very glad, Your Excellency." Suddenly, the witch pushed the golden-haired prince back. She smiled tenderly and opened her eyes wide. Squeezing the boy's shoulders quite tightly, she said, "But there is one condition." The boy asked again, not understanding. "Condition? What?" The blonde smiled even more, as if trying not to scare the little boy away. With her cold-bloodedness, she gently stroked the boy's shoulders and head. And then she exclaimed loudly, expectantly, "Give me yourself, yourself." "But how?" Not believing the words of his snow mistress, the little boy asked again. The lady leaned closer to the prince and squeezed his shoulders harder, painfully. "Just say your name," she spoke, clearly emphasizing each word. "Then you will belong to me." The boy looked at the girl in fear. Removing the girl's hand from his shoulder, he carefully closed his palms around hers. He looked tenderly at his new mother and slowly said, "You already know my name. You even taught me how to write it yourself." He awkwardly opened her hand. This time it was not so cold that it seemed strange to the golden-haired prince. Finally, the boy began to trace his own name on the lady's hand with his finger, saying, "Tita," like this. The girl pushed the boy away from her with a sharp movement. She said loudly. Her voice was no longer gentle or seductive. It was sometimes irritated and arrogant. "No, this name is a fake. Say the real name imprinted in your soul." The little golden-haired baby looked in fear at his snowy mistress, who exclaimed like a curse, "Only in this way can you become mine." He sincerely did not understand what she was tirelessly repeating. And so he asked again, "Real name?" Finally, he understood. He looked at the lady with surprise and admiration. "I don't know if it's real or not, but that's what they used to call me." He paused for a moment, hesitant to continue. Doubt still gnawed at him. "But why does Her Excellency ask my name? She already knows another, and I am sure that during our first meeting she called me Arfin." The prince thought, remembering that cold day when he was brought to the castle. "Not Arfin. Please call me Tita," the boy said then. "Tita? Your name is Tita?" the blonde witch asked in surprise that night. She opened her eyes wide, not understanding why the boy had introduced himself by another name. "She was even more surprised when I said Tita." The prince was remembering. Suddenly, the feeling inside his chest became so strong that the boy shuddered violently, not knowing how to breathe. He couldn't even move or look up at the blonde witch in front of him. The pain made him want to double over. When the spasms finally eased, he turned his attention to his precious pet. The little dog suddenly growled at the snow lady, something that had never happened before. The boy knelt down, closer to Snowball. Suddenly, the wind became too strong. The golden-haired little prince thought he was literally being blown off his feet. Although strong winds were not unusual in the mountains, this time it was much stronger than usual. Shivering from the cold, the boy could only shout that she was not Her Excellency. "Then who was she?" the boy asked, breaking his voice. Snowball stood in front of him, ready to pounce on the snow lady at any moment. "Don't you dare pretend to be Her Excellency," the boy screamed, shaking more and more. He himself could no longer figure out whether this was due to the cold, or fatigue, or fear of an unknown creature. The lady's eyes widened. She looked at him in surprise, amazement, incomprehension. She said, barely audibly, in her unusual soothing voice, "How could he destroy the illusion?" Even though it was a rhetorical question, the boy still didn't hear it. "She is not Her Excellency. I am sure of it," the boy thought. After all, Her Excellency never makes such a face. He recalled the expression on the snow lady's face. It could be emotionless, joyful, tired, but not like this. "Not crazy." Then the prince exclaimed, "I will never be yours. Go away." Laughing languidly, the blonde witch continued, "Fool, tell me your name. I would help you in an eternal happy life inside the illusion." The lady spoke barely audibly, but despite the gusts of wind, the prince could still hear her. But since everything turned out this way, the blonde witch looked at him again with that inexplicable look. She smiled and wanted to kill the boy at the same time. It made the blood run in her veins. "I will take you, even if by force," she finally said. She stretched out her cold, corpse-like hand towards him. Bending it, the girl pulled the boy and the dog towards herself. Snowball stopped growling for a moment, looking fearfully at the witch in front of him. The little prince tried to resist. She looked at such a precious victim with a crazy look. She pulled the little prince closer to her, wanting to get what she wanted faster. But suddenly there was a loud crack, as if something had broken. No, no, but how? The girl who looked painfully like Her Excellency, although she was not her, screamed. She began to shake her hand vigorously, which quickly disappeared. Piece by piece, parts of the Snow Lady's body fell off. Go back to where you came from. The young man's voice suddenly ceased to be childish, clear and cheerful. Only an adult, male, and confident voice could be heard. In the blink of an eye, it became alien and unrecognizable. The boy's eyes glowed bright red with an evil glare. He said threateningly to the lady, "You will never be able to take me." Despite all the immaturity of his face, at that moment he looked truly frightening and menacing. Tears started to flow down the fake girl's face. She laughed in her mind and thought, so this kid actually had such power. But for a kid, she just smiled weakly and replied, "Your confidence is incredible." The sky grew even darker. The moon no longer helped the darkness to dissipate. The snowfall increased. The poor child. The lady's voice sounded over the prince's head. "Do you think that presumptuous witch will truly love you? No, that will never happen. In the end, you will only be cruelly thrown out." The witch's illusion continued to speak. Despite all his apparent fortitude, the boy was still a child. He was still afraid of sleeping alone in a thunderstorm, afraid of being left alone, afraid of being abandoned. Scoffing at the fact that she saw the little prince scared, the girl decided to continue. "You'll see. You'll remember me." Then, looking into the boy's face, she said thoughtfully, "Someday you'll be mine." Suddenly, all this time only growling pet pounced on the fake snow lady. He tore her dress on her remaining arm and then bit in cold blood. It seemed that she did not even have blood. The red-eyed youth watched the explosion in amazement and couldn't move. On the one hand, he was relieved. It was all over. He needed to get home as quickly as possible, to his true snow mistress. But something still bothered him. Suddenly, the pain in his body became simply unbearable for the boy. He screamed at the top of his voice, hoping that he would be heard, that he would be helped, that he would be saved. But until that happened, the boy could only slowly bleed to death in the snow. Crying from pain, the little prince tried to open his eyes. But when nothing happened, he groaned pitifully, slowly muttering to himself, "I can't see anything. My eyes, what happened to them? Where is Snowball? What happened to him? My heart, it's very hot." Suddenly, only one image came to his mind. "Tita," she spoke tenderly. "Tita," the little prince heard the familiar voice again. Why did she come to his mind at this very moment? Maybe she could cope with his pain. But the smiling image of the blonde maiden did not disappear from the boy's mind. But suddenly, he was able to open his eyes. Breathing out heavily, the boy realized that he had no more strength left for anything, not even to move or think about anything. His eyes began to darken. The landscape around him became increasingly blurry and indistinct. "Your Excellency," that was the last thing the golden-haired boy said before he lost consciousness. His faithful dog sat next to him, whining pitifully, hoping that he could somehow help his master. The girl was standing in the middle of the library. She was holding a book in her hands and slowly turning the pages, completely immersed in reading. Suddenly, she heard a rustling sound. The source of the noise was in a distant corner. Cleet didn't pay attention to the rustling and continued leafing through the book. After turning another page, the girl came across some rather interesting information, so she held her gaze a little longer, reading every word. The book told of a cockatrice, a monster with the head of a rooster. The girl thought that roosters looked rather luxurious, so one of them would definitely appeal to a child of Tita's age. Clayt was completely lost in thought. The next page said that with the onset of puberty, the fighting instinct of this animal awakens. Therefore, it can be dangerous for such a small child as Tita. The girl was perplexed. Realizing that the idea with the monster rooster was a failure, the girl decided to turn the page. There she saw information about a very smart monster who even knows human language. His name is Seishi. The girl thought that he would even be able to play dolls with Seishi. But, to her great regret, the next paragraph said that Seisha is very cunning, so she always tries to defeat her master. The girl sighed and decided that this option should also be skipped. The witch was disappointed. The thought crossed her mind that perhaps the monster was indeed too much for a little boy like Tita. Cleet closed the book and put it back on the shelf. Her research into monsters today had yielded no results. She thought about how Snowball couldn't replace Tita as a person he could talk to. It seemed to the girl that this was the reason why the boy was always hanging around her and annoying her. So the witch decided to find him another friend, but to no avail. The witch spread her arms wide and sighed again. The girl said out loud that her expectations were too high. If this boy was afraid even of Snowball, it seemed impossible to her that he would cope with a real monster. The girl was tired after reading almost all the books about magical creatures that were on the shelves. She understood that it was difficult to find another monster as docile and smart as Snowball. Cleet lay down on the bed to rest a little. Then she remembered something that immediately made her sit up. There were also magical plants. The girl propped her head up with her hand and began to think about what kind of plant could have such a developed intellect that it could pass for Tita's friend. In her mind, although both were monsters, plants should be much more obedient than animals. Another plus was that if you take good care of them, a flower can grow. Another advantage of the plants was that Cleet could use their flowers in her research lab. She could already imagine making new dangerous potions from the poor plants that had their own consciousness. The girl thought that if it suddenly turned out that Tita had the ability to grow plants, she could take him as an assistant in her laboratory. But to do all this, she needed to find a suitable plant. Edmund ran into the room, interrupting the lady's thoughts with his appearance. He called loudly for Her Excellency and looked extremely tired after a long run. The witch shuddered from how abruptly the butler burst into her chambers. The witch asked loudly and reproachfully what could have happened that the butler had not even knocked. The man did not listen to her complaints to the end and loudly said that he could not find Mr. Tita. This news made the girl even more frightened. Cleet said there was nothing to worry about. The boy was probably just playing somewhere. But the butler didn't listen to the end again. His speech was hurried, and there was excitement in his voice. He said he hadn't been able to find him for several hours, and besides, today had been a difficult day. That day was the day of the Tebe rising, the full moon of the 13th month. Hearing this, Cleet's eyes also filled with excitement and widened. The girl shuddered. Now she too became afraid for the boy. He could run into trouble. The witch quickly realized what she had to do. She turned sharply and looked at the butler, saying that it was not yet time for the moon to rise. Her voice trembled, since on the day of the moonrise, after the moonrise, there was no chance to pull Tita out. Cleet said that if she hurried and looked for him. But the girl did not have time to finish the sentence. The room was pitch dark, but now her hair was illuminated by a white light. All the girl's hopes were shattered into pieces. Noticing that the lighting had changed dramatically and the room had brightened, the witch turned towards the window. Edmund and Cleet looked in shock at the sky, which was now illuminated by the white light of the celestial body. Cleet could not believe that the moon had already risen. On the last day of the full moon of this year, the girl and the butler stared at the moon. Neither of them could have imagined that they would be so scared just by looking at this giant white ball in the sky. Also, the day of the full moon's rise was called the day of Tebe's rise. Tebe was the protector of spirits. Spirits received the power of this powerful moon, lost their composure, and splashed out all their power in full measure. A truly terrible phenomenon. And the witch never kept track of the calendar of these full moons, since she was not in any danger. But Tita was different. Tita was a very small child, and Belos was currently overflowing with magical energy, which had a huge effect on him. The girl's face darkened. She said in a dark tone that she had forgotten to tell the boy that he was not allowed to go out that evening. Edmund interrupted her self-digging monologue. The man announced that he had said what he had said, but something told him that he should have paid more attention to it. Cleet turned to the butler again. The girl said that they would decide later who was to blame. But now there were more important matters. She also asked where Snowball was now. Edmund answered that the beast was also not visible. The man dared to assume that he was now next to Mr. Tita. The witch was glad about this. If Snowball was with the boy, then they could already avoid the worst outcome. The thought warmed her heart, but the problem was still a problem. The boy was somewhere outside the walls of this castle. She didn't want to believe it, so she ordered Edmund to search all the rooms of the castle again. Or better yet, twice. The girl herself went to look for the boy on the walking path in the garden. Edmund quickly disappeared from sight. The moon was shining, with a treacherously bright light. The girl went out into the garden to look for Tita. It was snowing outside, windy and nasty, but she was used to it. Now the main task was to bring the boy back alive and well. At the same time, Edmund was running down the corridor at breakneck speed. He was calling out loudly for Mr. Tita, hoping that he was simply hiding somewhere and would appear in the middle of the corridor. His hurried steps echoed between the walls. The Archduchess also hurried along the path in the garden. She also shouted Tita's name loudly, hoping to find him there. Visibility was very poor due to the flying snow and the darkness of the night, but the light of the moon helped her not to lose her way. There was only one thought going through her head. The thought that Tita might be somewhere nearby. Spirits were very fickle and loved to play pranks, so she couldn't even imagine what could have happened to the boy. The girl was completely desperate and tired of such rapid movements. Beads of sweat were running down her face, and the snow was slowly melting in her hair. The only thing she wanted now was for the boy to return as soon as possible. She looked down the path again, making sure there was no one there. Cleet blamed herself. The weight of guilt for being so inattentive and forgetful lay on her shoulders like a heavy stone and prevented her from breathing normally. The girl thought that since this child lived in harsh conditions and was destined to live in them further, it would be enough to show just a little interest, and then he himself would grow up as needed. But not everything was so simple. Cleet clenched her fists until they hurt. She didn't want to believe that the cold lands of Belos would eventually kill the boy. He was lost all alone, surrounded by monsters and permafrost. What could be worse? In her mind, she wished for the boy to be safe. The witch used her teleportation skill, and in a moment, her silhouette disappeared into the snowstorm. She was ready to comb every inch of the surrounding area just to find the boy. The girl found herself near the back entrance to the castle. There was also a veranda there. She landed neatly on the ground after the teleportation spell threw her into the air. Cleet continued to quickly look around the surroundings. To her great happiness, after some time, the girl heard the puppy whining. She turned around sharply to check if it was Snowball. Now she wanted to believe that it was him. After all, if the dog was here, then Tita was somewhere nearby too. The girl's eyes widened as she realized everything that had happened and saw the picture that opened up to her gaze. It was terribly scary. The girl's hands began to shake. Now her accusations against herself became even louder. There, on the ground, right in front of her, lay Tita. His hands were blue from the cold, and his golden hair was now covered in snow. Next to the boy stood his dog, still whining. He was shivering from the cold. The fact that he could still stand on his paws was his small feat. Cleet picked up the boy and thought that his breathing was quite weak, and his temperature had dropped significantly. This was clearly not a good sign. It was necessary to bring him back to consciousness as soon as possible. Tita was shaking in her arms. The girl realized that his condition was even worse than she had assumed. The boy looked as if he was about to take his last breath, and this frightened the witch very much. The girl decided that she needed to take him to a warm place as soon as possible. She was going to use the teleportation spell again. Snowball stood at her feet, and also continued to shiver and whine from the unbearable cold. A few seconds later, she found herself next to Edmund, who continued to run aimlessly through the corridors, in chaotic directions, trying to find the boy. The man noticed that the girl was holding Tita in her arms. The butler was glad that the gentleman had been found. But then his face changed again and became gloomy. He noticed the critical condition of the young gentleman lying in the arms of the Archduchess. The girl shouted to Edmund to quickly find a place to put Tita. The witch read some spell in an incomprehensible language, which somehow resembled a mixture of Korean and Latin. A clot of green energy appeared in her hand, which increased in size with each passing second. The girl continued to mutter unintelligible words, and then put her hand to the boy's forehead. He looked quite sick, he was hot, and his skin was cold and pale, like a dead man's. The witch did not know what to do, as the boy did not react even after she used a strong restorative spell on him. Hearing this, Edmund completely despaired. He was already thinking about how he would justify himself to the emperor if he suddenly showed up to take his son. Cleet added that if this miracle spell does not work, then there are some problems in his soul. And if the boy's soul is damaged, then some powerful monster tried. This frightened the butler, and the witch herself was no less frightened. Edmund went to extremes and suggested that the spirits could have taken the master's soul. This was the very outcome that could not even be thought of now. Too real and too scary to be this very reality. Because in that case, this boy will never be able to wake up on his own again. Hearing this, the butler sighed. It would have been better if he had not put forward this assumption at all. Cleet sat over the bed where Tita lay and tried to think of what to do next. Suddenly, an idea came to her mind. The first and only one for all that time. There was no time to think, so she sharply called out to the butler. He reacted just as quickly and responded to the call of Her Excellency. The girl told him in a cold and gloomy tone to stay here and watch Tita's physical condition. And she herself was going to go and personally find his soul. They had no other options, so the girl was completely confident in her powers and words. In the middle of the dark, mysterious room stood a girl of unearthly beauty, the Archduchess herself. Her hair was beautifully fluttering in the wind. At the same time, strange voices were haunting her. "Mother, I am lonely. It hurts. Snowball, Mr. Edmund." Still not understanding everything that was happening, being in this unusual room, a voice was heard, "Your Excellency." Then the girl with snow-white hair thought that she was inside the mind of darkness. Earlier, in this same marvelous castle, the butler, who goes by the name of Edmund, was a little confused, and his indignation showed it. He asked if the Archduchess was sure everything would be all right. The respected Frost Witch, looking gloomily at the picture unfolding before her, was also not delighted with everything that was happening. But she only said that they had no other way out, which could help them. The emperor's son, the young heir to the throne, slept peacefully in his cradle, while two adults looked on. The Archduchess confidently said that they really couldn't let him sleep for the rest of his life. This is a technique that allows you to personally interfere with another person's mind. Although it takes some time and allows you to penetrate someone else's subconscious, it can be dangerous for those who have fallen into eternal sleep. Cleet closed her eye and concentrated all her magic power on getting into Tita's mind. She hoped that everything would work out the first time, and she would be able to save this little boy as soon as possible. Then the girl suddenly opened her eyes and realized that she was in a completely different place, which did not even remotely resemble the room she had been in before. A cold wind blew on her face, and her magical powers were gradually being replenished. The girl tried to penetrate the mind of the little heir. In the end, she realized that she had succeeded. The Snow Witch exhaled calmly and said how good it was that she had been able to penetrate there safely. She said to herself that of course Cleet had used this technique several times, but this was the first time she had used consciousness magic on her mind, rather than her physical body. Remembering her words earlier, she thought that she shouldn't have said this to Edmund so confidently. She walked carefully through this place, trying to make as little noise as possible when moving. Now she already regretted that she had given the butler a promise that she would save the boy. Now she was not sure of anything. Cold and monotonous footsteps echoed in this beautiful hall, which was actually the mind of a young boy. The Archduchess knew that this was her only option, and she had only to try. Suddenly, the room was filled with a strange glow. It seemed that this light was consuming everything around it, destroying the visions and wiping this place off the face of the earth. Perhaps this light was the only thing left of the kind Tita she knew. Then a blinding light caught the Snow Lady's eye, which made her recoil and scream. It was not just a bright light, but a piercing beam. Because of this, the girl quickly closed her blue eyes. Blue Eyes opened her eyes cautiously, because she began to hear voices again, saying, "Her Excellency the Archduchess seems very frightening, and the way she speaks is very scary. Playing with dolls, playing with nothing, tired, boring." The girl was surprised that these were all Tita's thoughts. The thoughts continued to go further. "And yet I like Her Excellency. I like her more than anyone in this world, even more than my mother." These thoughts made the Archduchess shudder and be surprised. The unearthly beauty of the Snow Witch of these cold lands blushed awkwardly, coughing. She thought how fortunate that Edmund was an ordinary person. If he heard this, he would have made fun of the poor girl for 10 years. The girl resolutely pressed her lips together. She pulled herself together and quickly walked further through the fantastic space, saying to herself that she didn't have so much time to hang out in this place. She needed to concentrate. The girl quickened her pace, trying to find Tita as quickly as possible. She believed that he was waiting for her somewhere at the end of this long and dark path. Cleet herself could not believe that she was walking through the corners of a child's mind. Desperate cries pierced the mind of the little emperor's heir like icy shards. It was the Snow Witch trying to reach him. "Tita, Tita, if you are here, please answer me." The Archduchess listened to her thoughts, which grew more and more in confusion. They seemed to be muttering something. "Mama is not coming back, but everything will be all right since I have Her Excellency. I would be glad if she hugged me again." The Snow Witch's hand shook as if she was being pierced by thousands of needles. She thought, are these really the feelings a small child might have? It was the first time she had seen such lonely and sad thoughts. The thoughts, in turn, did not stop. What if she leaves me? Will I be able to become a useful child? The girl realized that she had problems. Neither she nor Tita, neither of them would ever be able to wake up. She shouted his name loudly again. "Tita!" She screamed his name again, shrilly. If the boy could hear her, he would have heard her by now. The girl was ready to lose her voice, trying to reach the boy, if it meant that he would return alive and unharmed. Carefully feeling the walls, she thought to herself, where could he be hiding? The more time passes, the higher the probability that the soul of the little heir of the emperor will simply disappear without a trace. Confused, she had no choice. Sighing heavily, the Archduchess sank into thought. Her gaze slid to the side and she muttered to herself, "It seems I was mistaken, and I don't feel any traces at all anymore." Cleet looked down, unwilling to look up, in some way afraid of what she might encounter on her way. The witch heard strange rustling sounds around her. These sounds were very similar to the sounds of a burning flame. Lost in her thoughts, the Snow White girl wondered if she should finish for today and start again tomorrow. When a strange thing rushed past her, she was immediately seized by the question, what just happened? A path of magical energy appeared before Cleet's eyes. It was this that was making those sounds of burning flame. The girl decided that she needed to follow the trail left by this strange, previously unknown to her, magic. The girl quickened her pace, realizing that every second counted now, and she absolutely couldn't lag behind the magical purple path. The heels of her shoes were tapping on the floor at a furious pace, and the hem of her dress was fluttering in the air. Cleet thought that if she didn't do it now, she would never be able to find out what it was. The girl sincerely didn't understand what this purple beam was and why it was trying to lead her somewhere. Thinking about it, she again sped up her running pace, The witch could no longer run. Her strength was leaving her. She had not used any magic so far, but ran only with her own efforts. After such a long time of running, the girl began to choke and finally stopped to catch her breath. Out of breath, the Archduchess stopped, looking around at the unknown territory around her. She suddenly realized that she had gone too far, and also that mysterious energy that she had been pursuing had disappeared without a trace. The girl had only two options for how this guiding thread could break. The first option was that the one who created it was defeated, and the second was that she reached her destination. The girl wanted to believe in the second, so she looked around. Cleet still didn't understand what it could be. This purple path didn't look like the power of any spirit she knew. She was lost in thought, trying to understand what she was dealing with. Ignorance only made her afraid. Suddenly, strange voices were heard around the girl. It seemed that someone was muttering something unintelligible. She began to tremble from the fear that was overcoming her body. With each passing second, the muttering became louder and more frightening. The girl found the strength to turn around and take another look around the room. There, in a distant corner, stood a tall and massive monster with a murderous aura. At first, the girl thought that this monster was hostile, but then she remembered something. This monster seemed to be Tita's subconscious. The girl understood this because there could be no one else here in Tita's mind. The witch decided that it was very dangerous and should not be touched. The red monster began to growl. The girl concentrated her magical powers around herself, finally deciding that it was time for her to go back. Today had yielded no results. She had met nothing except this monster, and if she had lingered a little longer. Before Cleet could finish her thought, the dome of her magical energy was torn apart by this red something. No one had ever dared to even try to defeat the witch in battle with magic, because everyone knew that she had no equal. But now, she was attacked by some monster. The girl did not expect such a turn of events, and sincerely did not understand how she could have ended up in such a situation, and why today. She barely protected herself from the blow. Her last memory from there was of her barrier magic starting to crack like broken glass. It was truly terrifying. What colossal power that monster must have had to break through such a powerful spell. Cleet lay with her eyes closed, trembling. In reality, this fight did not look as epic as it did in Tita's mind. The butler could only see the girl's eyebrows drawn together from tension, and beads of sweat appearing on her face. Edmund became alarmed when he noticed that the girl was shaking. He couldn't help her, but he knew he had to do something. The man stared at the witch, still sitting in place. The best solution would probably be to wake her up. The man continued to look at the Archduchess, and then, after a short silence, he called out to her. The girl continued to tremble, and he could not even understand why. Edmund, unfortunately, did not possess any magical powers. Meanwhile, Cleet still hadn't woken up. She was still in Tita's mind. The girl rose from her knees and wiped the blood from her mouth with her hand. She was ready to continue the fight with the monster, even if it threatened her death. The witch thought it was impossible. She continued to stare at the monster, but recently appeared before her and could not believe her eyes. Her guesses about him were too absurd to be true. The girl looked at this red, huge monster and thought that she had never heard of such a strong subconscious that it was even capable of. The monster growled at the girl and was clearly in an aggressive mood. This something could even influence the physical body. What can I say? It was so strong that it easily repelled all attacks of a witch who had lived in this world for more than 200 years. And this is just the subconscious of a little boy. What was he hiding inside himself? Something started to click loudly and sharply, and the girl reacted too late. A moment later, another blow from the strange creature hit her body. She opened her eyes wide in pain and surprise, and could not believe that she was fighting the subconscious. And then the blow was repeated again. This time its force was enough to throw the girl to the other corner of the room. She hit her back painfully against a column. The knock echoed throughout the room, and the monster was ready to attack again. The witch was shaking with pain, But after a few blows, she was no longer so afraid. Blood was dripping from the corner of her mouth. Raising herself slightly on her hands, Cleet felt a strong desire to cough up blood, which she did. The girl could not believe that this monster was anticipating her defensive tactics and constantly changing its attack style. It got on her nerves and made this monster invincible in her eyes. Cleet glanced at him furtively. Could this really be Tita's power? If it was as she had just imagined, then this boy had enormous power, capable of killing several mages with just one blow. His subconscious, this terrible monster, was his power. Even though the boy was the main character, that's all seemed to the girl a little too strong a force for a character in a second-rate novel. She cursed the author for such an unequal distribution of power between the characters. Isn't the buff on him too strong? The girl thought indignantly. Now I understand why Cleet lost to Arfin. The lady thought, her mouth open from the realization of the fact that such a huge power was hidden in a small boy. The huge insect rushed towards the witch and squealed. If this is the power of a 7-year-old child in an unconscious state, then I can't even imagine what she became after he grew up, she thought, watching the spider's movements. Instinctively stretching her arms upward, the girl created a magical shield around herself. The monster's blow did not destroy the beauty's defense, although it was quite strong. The shield only turned red from the blow, and the girl exclaimed in surprise. And yet it is not right for an adult to go face to face with a 7-year-old, the blonde witch thought, continuing to defend herself. From the red spider's strong and frequent blows, the lady's defense was constantly shaking and flaring, until her knuckles turned white and thought about it. The one who attacks and the one who can only defend himself. Her hand was covered in blood. Her fingers were scratched in some places, and in others the snow-white skin was completely torn off and now covered in abrasions. Tears began to flow from the girl's eyes. She threw her head back as she realized the doom of the situation. This is a battle with a certain winner and loser. I can't waste time on such a useless fight. Breaking her own defenses, the girl ran closer to the monster. She screamed at the top of her voice. Tita! She called helplessly for her adopted son, seeing only an ugly monster in front of her. In response, the spider only screamed. Come back, Tita! The witch screamed, tearing her own voice. The huge paws of the crimson monster began to tremble violently. The monster no longer sought to kill the blonde girl, only freezing in one place. Everyone is waiting for you. Answer me if you can hear me. The lady cried out, heart-rendingly, looking menacingly at the boy's strength. Her face was also already covered in bruises and scratches. Her chin was completely broken, and there was almost no skin left on her cheeks. But the monster's hesitation did not last long. He quickly raised his paws upward, approaching the snowy archduchess. The girl held her breath, afraid of what might happen next. The monster's red claws reached out to the fair-haired blonde. The girl looked at them in fear, trying to retreat, but it wouldn't help her much anyway. The monster would quickly catch up with her, due to its enormous size. The blonde witch frowned and clenched her jaw. She tried to mentally prepare herself for the physical pain that this little golden-haired prince's bundle of power could cause the girl. But there was no pain. The witch slowly, distrustfully, opened her eyes. Looking for a catch around herself, she slowly looked at her legs, arms, body. The mistress was looking for signs of damage. The lady was afraid to look up, but that was her mistake. The blonde girl shuddered. She felt something coming very close to her. The monster's claw was already near her eyes. The witch could only stare at it in amazement. What? Why did his attack stop? The girl thought in confusion. The lady sighed in relief and looked at the monster's trembling paw. The spider was slowly removing it from the cold-blooded archduchess's face. Suddenly, the ice on which the girl stood began to crumble. One by one, thick shards of cold ice broke off. The lady did not understand what was happening, but she clearly felt the ground slipping out from under her feet. The girl tried to recoil and move away from the cracking ice, but the cracks spread too quickly to everything they saw in front of them. Then the girl heard the last sound of breaking ice. The lady realized that she no longer felt support. Something pulled her down, under the ice, with a strange force. She fell slowly, not daring to cope with such a strong wind around her. It did not even let her breathe, but maybe it was because of fear. She fell into the cold, icy water. Like a limp doll, she floundered in the depths of the reservoir. It was quite painful when she first plunged into the water, but after a few seconds, she had already gotten used to the low temperature. Tita, the blonde witch, tried to say, but in the end, she only let out all the air. The lady closed her eyes in irritation. Her snow-white hair was tangled and wet, and her clothes began to stick unpleasantly to her body. Suddenly, the girl saw the golden hair that was painfully familiar to her. The boy was sitting curled up in the very depths of the pond. The witch awkwardly extended her palms to him. A bright glow emanated from the protective sphere in which the prince was located. The little prince's thin, sad voice echoed throughout the water. "No matter who, I just want someone to hold me." Hearing his voice, the girl was sure it was him. "Tita," the girl said, starting to swim towards him. "I don't want to be alone. I want someone." A child's voice muttered. The blonde finally managed to swim to the boy. She carefully extended her hand to him. From the side, it seemed that the child was crying. Having broken the boy's shield, the girl took his hand tightly, afraid that the prince would let her go. The little tyrant continued to speak. "I want someone to love me." The boy finished the sentence, carefully holding the lady's hand. "Come back, Tita," the blonde witch thought. She frowned. There was not enough air, and her eyes darkened. She tried to shake off the spell, but it was all in vain. The girl looked at the boy one last time and closed her eyes. The lady rose abruptly from her soft bed and looked around in bewilderment. When she came to, she was already in her estate, not in the cold water, and she also did not see the little prince next to her. "My whole body aches," the witch thought tiredly. "Your Excellency, are you okay? It seemed to me that you were there too long, so I was worried." The elderly butler asked her awkwardly, in a worried voice. "What? I didn't think I was that late," the blonde witch said, thoughtfully. She looked at the window. The curtains were already open, and the room was flooded with bright sunlight. "No, it seems I was there all night," the lady thought. The girl suddenly remembered the little golden-haired prince. She exclaimed loudly, "What's wrong with Tita?" She was clearly nervous and worried about her adopted son. The lady jumped up from her seat, despite the burning pain in her body. The girl turned around and saw that on the next bed, peacefully sleeping, a tired little golden-haired prince was lying. "It seems that you have managed to bring back Mr. Tita," the butler said happily. Hearing loud, adult voices, the little tyrant woke up. He sleepily opened his eyes, squinting from the bright sunlight that shone directly into his red eyes. The boy was surprised that from the very moment he woke up, Her Excellency and Mr. Edmund decided to visit him. "Your Excellency," the little boy asked in surprise. "And Mr. Edmund, what are you doing here?" the boy said, sleepily. "Mr. Tita, Tita," the butler and the snow lady exclaimed in unison, looking at the boy with concern. Suddenly, the girl jumped up from her seat and rushed to her prince. She hugged him tightly, leaving the baby in bewilderment. "Your Excellency?" he asked in surprise, not expecting such a rush of tenderness. "I was so worried that you would never open your eyes again," the lady exclaimed. The blonde witch was shaking violently. She hugged him even tighter, pulling him closer. "What are you talking about?" the boy asked again, uncomprehending. "I just woke up from a dream," he said thoughtfully. Leaning closer to the bed, the old man said, "Thank God you've come to your senses, Mr. Tita. How are you feeling? Are you feeling sick?" he asked. "No, not at all. But I can't understand what you're talking about," the little boy said thoughtfully. But suddenly, the blonde witch gently pushed him away from her, creating a small space between them. The little golden-haired prince still did not understand the inexplicable behavior of Mr. Edmund and the snow lady. The cool-headed archduchess gently took the boy by the shoulders. Almost with tears in her eyes, the girl happily answered, Everything is fine. Everything will be fine now. The boy watched her actions, fascinated. Because from now on, I will hug you even more often, the fair-haired witch exclaimed cordially. From such affectionate words, the boy with red eyes blushed deeply, and he himself, not believing what was happening, delved into every word spoken. But the happiness did not last long. The cold-blooded lady's hair flew all over the bed, and some strands fell on the boy's clothes. In the first moments, he looked in surprise, not realizing what had happened. The body of the young Archduchess fell limply onto the blanket. "Your Excellency?" the boy exclaimed in fear. The elderly butler quickly ran to her side, looking in surprise at the girl who had recently looked quite healthy. "Your Excellency, come to your senses." The man began to wail in a loud voice. The girl's face was lying on the bed. She had lost consciousness. Her face had relaxed. From the outside, it seemed that the girl was simply fast asleep. The girl woke up in pitch darkness. Around her were only a couple of tall trees that grew out of the void. The Snow Witch looked around in surprise, trying to figure out where she was this time. She turned her head, looking at the flower tree. It was shedding purple, lilac leaves. "This place," the blonde witch said barely audibly, muttering quietly under her breath. Her blue eyes glowed in the pitch darkness. A familiar silhouette stood before the witch. She would always recognize that hair, and would recognize it out of 1,000. The golden-haired little prince stood with his back to the young witch. He was wearing his overalls, but, strangely enough, there were no trees near him. "Could it be that curly yellow hair?" the girl said, sighing heavily. He was out of the house again, and therefore not safe. The boy did not react to the lady's words, as if he had not heard her muttering at all. A bright light emanated from the baby, as if, instead of a shadow, he cast rays of the sun, in the footsteps of which the blonde witch ran towards him. Her snow-white hair slowly stretched, not keeping up with the lady's run. "Tita?" she asked in surprise. The cold-blooded Archduchess only repeated louder, "Tita, is it really you?" She came much closer to the baby, and then extended her trembling hands to him. Perhaps it was at that moment that the little one finally heard her voice. The boy turned sharply and looked at his foster mother. His eyes glowed an evil red, and his pupils shrank to phenomenal sizes. He opened his own eyes wide, looking at the lady. The girl woke up in a cold sweat, but there were colors around her. There was furniture. She felt her body and that she was alive. The Archduchess opened her eyes wide in fear, catching her breath from the recent horror. "What? When did I fall asleep?" the lady thought in surprise. "I had never slept so deeply, ever since I became a witch." The girl thought tiredly, remembering her own past life. She slowly began to get up from the bed. The blonde girl felt someone else's presence in the room. A child cried out loudly behind her. "You're finally awake, Your Excellency." The lady looked at him in surprise. "Why are you in my room at this hour?" the Archduchess almost screamed. "Go back to your room at once," she said. "This is my room, Your Excellency," the boy said awkwardly. "What?" the lady exclaimed in surprise. And only then did she notice the toys scattered around the room. "And Edmund, he just left without even carrying me to my room," the blonde asked in surprise. The man at that moment was already wandering the corridors of the castle, melodically humming an old song to himself. "At first, he wanted to do that, but you hugged me and wouldn't let go. So he said, to just let you sleep here," the kid said, puzzled. The girl sighed heavily. "Damn him, you hear all sorts of things." Having hugged the boy, the Archduchess said sleepily, "Is it possible that I could fall fast asleep, hugging you?" The joyful prince only pressed himself closer to the blonde, who was already lying on the pillows. The cold-blooded lady blushed deeply, looking at her behavior. She opened her eyes wide in shame at what she was doing. The girl suddenly turned pale. Her eyes looked into the void in fear. "And how long was I in this position?" the lady asked awkwardly. The boy answered thoughtfully, "About 12 hours, I think." The girl thought, "I want to faint again." "Your Excellency," the prince exclaimed, "but I feel so warm and pleasant." she realized bashfully. It was a terribly cold night, even for the castle. Somewhere in the back of the witch's workshop, a potion was brewing. It was an unpleasant, bright green color. It also gave off a strange aroma. It had been brewed for a long time, and so it was bubbling just barely audibly. In the same room, all alone, sat the blonde witch. She warmed herself on such cold days near the burning fireplace. From time to time, that little tyrant would come to her, but this time no one dared to come to her. The girl looked sadly at the dying fireplace, thinking about yesterday's dialogue. It was hard to say that she was not worried about the boy at all, but she herself did not really want to admit it. Scrolling through different versions of events, the lady decided to remember yesterday in more detail. Last night, the lady came to the little boy's bedroom. The boy seemed nervous as he told her what had happened. It was a little strange. He stuttered, "I am sure I intended to finish the walk before sunset, as Mr. Edmund had ordered." The boy, wrapped in a blanket, looked pitifully at the fair-haired witch, who was tightly squeezing his trembling palms, sitting on his bed. But when he passed by the rose garden, everything around him suddenly went dark. Then, lost in thought, the boy paused for a few seconds, but then continued, "And this may naturally seem strange, but something seemed to me there." The Snow Lady nodded, supporting with a worried voice. "Continue." Clutching the blanket, the boy said barely audibly, "It seems to me that the rose spoke to me, and I don't remember what else happened then." The boy said awkwardly. His voice was not at all like the one he had that night. It became childish and ringing again. The blonde witch's eye twitched slightly. Her dark blue eyes became even darker, and her pupil widened. Most likely after that, a spirit attacked him. The girl thought doomedly, looking at the boy's face. The little prince smiled slightly, embarrassed. The lady thought? But something was wrong here. He attacked a small harmless boy for no reason. She looked at the boy again, trying to catch signs of a lie. The Snow Lady raised her chin and asked incredulously, "Nothing happened while you were out. Any little things will be needed, so tell me everything." She raised her eyebrows, hoping that the boy would not hide anything from her. Lost in thought, the little golden-haired prince began to slowly rub his chin, trying to remember something unusual. Snowball was behaving badly, the boy thought. Then it quickly became dark. The rose was talking. He thought, "That's right, a rose." He looked at his finger. "In fact, I cut my finger while looking at the roses, so I bled a little," said the little tyrant, showing his slightly cut finger. The wound was not big or deep, but it stood out brightly on his light skin. The fair-haired witch looked at her adopted son's finger in surprise. The puzzle in her head suddenly came together, and there were practically no questions left for the boy. Blood, the lady thought doomedly. The spirit learned of Tita's power through the blood that splashed on the blue rose. The girl understood, imagining how it could have happened. He was a child. He saw something beautiful. He stretched. He got hurt. The Snow Lady thought, in any weather, the roses were the most beautiful thing in the area. The roses growing in the ice castle had my magic placed on them. After all, if they weren't, they wouldn't be able to survive the cold. Since he controlled the roses with my magic placed in them, he was a high-class spirit, at least at the level of Tebe. Remembering the outlines of the roses in the water, the girl thought, Tebe. Wait, if it was Tebe, then anything was possible. He had incredible power, with which he could seal Tita's soul in the world without consciousness. In that case, the fragments scattered around Tita must have been roses with Tebe's magic embedded in them. Sadly studying the young boy's face, the fair-haired girl thought about what had happened, knowing that it was better not to tell the little golden-haired prince about it for now. "When we figure everything out, then I'll tell you," she thought. But in the end, he was afraid of Tita's power, which turned out to be much greater than he thought, and then he ran away. The girl with blue eyes understood, looking more and more closely into the boy's face. The prince looked at the lady in bewilderment. Leaning wearily closer to the fireplace, the lady exhaled wearily. Her head ached terribly from worry. After all, she had been thinking about it all night, and all of the morning that had just begun. Her body ached a little from fatigue. Looking at her half leg, the blonde witch thought again. If the roses that acted as a mediator in his attack were torn into small pieces, then if Tita had been even a little weaker, we would not have gotten off with just that. I can't even properly protect one small child, the cold Archduchess thought wearily. So what kind of mistress of the lands of eternal frost am I? She asked her question quietly, knowing that no one would give her an answer. Come to think of it, the lady thought, discontinuous memories suddenly came to her mind. She needed to get a complete picture of what had happened, to know how to protect the little golden-haired prince. When I lost consciousness for a moment, I saw a man who looked like Tita, the girl thought, watching the crackling coals in the fireplace. It burned brightly, not allowing the snow lady to freeze for a second. Really you? The frightened girl with blue eyes awkwardly addressed the golden-haired boy. From behind, he strongly reminded her of her exemplary son, and therefore she was very surprised to see him here. The little prince, or someone who resembled him, turned sharply to the snow lady. He looked at the blonde with a wild expression, as if he wanted blood or revenge or something worse. But that look definitely did not belong to him, the lady thought. The girl's hands shook, and her body trembled at the memory of that day. Unpleasant memories, the cold-blooded Archduchess thought. She herself did not understand why it was his gaze that frightened her so much. Suddenly, a terrible guess came to mind. The girl's pupils became much smaller, and her gaze became less focused. She looked literally into nowhere. It was difficult to comprehend and give a little more realism to her own thought. Arfin, the lady said barely audibly, when something exploded behind her. It was a very loud bang, from which the girl shuddered strongly. But turning around, she realized that it was just a potion, which the girl forgot about. I'm scared, the blonde witch said, in a voice trembling with excitement. Has so much time already passed? The girl suddenly asked a rhetorical question into the void. She looked at the window. It was already light there. Quickly approaching the potions stand, the beauty began to rummage around the entire table, muttering under her breath, "Where did I put that thing?" There were entire stacks of books scattered around it, and the table was in complete chaos. Suddenly, the lady felt something that looked like a yellowed roll of paper. She grabbed it tightly, and lifting it up, said joyfully, "Finally, I found you." The girl looked at him admiringly. "I'll think about Tebeha later," the blonde witch said, barely audibly. "And now I have to do something much more important." The girl continued, quickly tearing up the parchment that she had been looking for on the table for so long. Suddenly, a strong wind rose around the cold-blooded Archduchess. It seemed to whirl her in a silent dance, not allowing her to leave it for a second. The girl's dress flew around, and with her hands raised, the girl was already preparing to use magic. It was not a very pleasant process for the blonde girl. All the light locks of hair were tangled, her dress was wrinkled, and strong streams of air almost hit her face. She frowned, trying to survive these few moments. In just one moment, the space was cut. There was no trace left of the previous heartbreaking flow of air. The girl was no longer in the workshop, carried away by such a treacherous, strong wind. Before the young witch's eyes appeared a green, as if eternally summer, forest. The tallest trees, covered in green foliage, towered above her. The sun shone high in the sky. Only the plaintive moan of the Archduchess disturbed the harmony. The lady muttered softly to herself as she stood up from the green grass. "My head is spinning much more than I expected. I think I'll have to take this a little more seriously during the next creation." "Luckily, I've come to the right place," said the fair-haired witch, when she was finally able to get up from the ground and look around. Unlike the lands of eternal cold in Belos, it was sunny and warm here. There was green and bright greenery all around. This flower garden, completely different from Belos, is managed by a young Raikun named Ravel. The girl thought, remembering a familiar person, a wolf. She slowly walked on the cold ground, which had not yet had time to warm up. "Last time I brought a snowball," the girl thought, looking at the blossoming flowers. They were very beautiful and delicate, not like the blue roses in Belos, which can hurt you and call a high-class spirit. Taking one flower in her hand, the blonde witch thought again. This time, I would like to create a friend that matches Tita's tastes. The flower was very fragile. It could easily be torn off or broken if you simply held it incorrectly. The girl squatted down to lean as close to the flowers as possible. When her face was already in a piece of flowers, she thought, what a pleasant aroma. A weak, but very memorable delicate smell emanated from the bushes. Suddenly, heavy, unhurried steps were heard from behind the girl. Someone had come to her, looking questioningly at the girl. The man smiled, drawing out the vowels. His voice was clear, although it clearly did not sound like a child's. Mrs. Cleet? A male voice asked mockingly from behind, drawing out each word. The blonde girl, not expecting to meet anyone here, quickly turned around in surprise to look at the uninvited guest. When the lady turned around, the man exclaimed triumphantly, I was right after all. The Archduchess did not understand at first who it was, because the silhouette was standing quite far from her, and therefore she could not see it. Coming a little closer, the cold-blooded lady saw how the man's ears suddenly rose and pricked up, like dogs when they are happy about something. He had light hair, Raikon, the girl thought. He smiled broadly, showing his snow-white, sharp fangs to the lady, as if they could be used to burden someone. The girl thought, we haven't seen each other for so long. The man exclaimed even louder, this time across the entire space. Welcome, Your Excellency. Ravel addressed her. He was a brave, tall guy with snow-white long hair. He was wearing an unbuttoned shirt, and in his hands he held a bouquet of daisies and sunflowers. Smiling warmly, the fair-haired witch barely audibly uttered, Ravel. She looked at him joyfully, rising from under a bush of delicate flowers. The curls of her snow-white hair were slightly tangled, but looked no less beautiful for that. The dark man, almost purring, answered, why did you come so late? He asked affectionately. The lady's smile disappeared from her face in the blink of an eye. She frowned and looked sternly at her old acquaintance. If you had warned me that you were coming, I would have gone to the castle to meet you, the young man exclaimed, kneeling before the Archduchess. He looked at her pitifully. Yes, Ravel was always like that, the girl thought. I missed you so much. The man almost screamed with joy, wagging his tail. He quickly stood up from his knees and went to the lady to hug her. What kind of disgusting tenderness is this? Move away, the lady asked, pushing him away. To push the guy away from her, the girl had to grab his cheeks. In response, the man only laughed quietly. He is the grandson of the head of the Raikon family, but he loves plants more than meat, which is why he was known as an eccentric, even among his own kind. From his earliest childhood, he had been very attached to plants, the fair-haired witch thought, remembering the old days when this mature man was still a little baby who loved to roll around in the flower fields. So, in the end, he opened his flower garden in these cruel lands. The girl thought, seeing a happy young man among the flower bushes in front of her. Despite his obvious differences from his relatives, he was able to follow his dream and find peace. While you were gone, my heart continued to freeze like a glacier. The youth spoke artistically, sighing tragically. He depicted a picture of a terrible blizzard around him. What a pity. It would be nice if your face froze a little too, the lady said irritably. Anyway, enough greetings. The blonde witch continued coldly, turning away from the dark-skinned youth. I need to see the flower trees. Monsters will do too. The girl decided to add for clarification. Recently, a fair-haired beauty asked a boy, Tita, do you like flowers? That evening, it was terribly cold, and a strong wind raged outside the window. And so the girl came to the golden-haired prince to help him fall asleep. Yes, the little tyrant exclaimed enthusiastically. I used to grow wild flowers from time to time, the boy told, watching the Archduchess in front of him. He was sitting under a gray, thick, and warm blanket. The blonde thought for a moment. Wild flowers then. How like him. She looked tiredly into the boy's red eyes. "Then do you like fancy flowers or ordinary ones?" the girl asked. The young boy fell silent for a moment, lost in thought, but then quietly answered, "Gorgeous." He fidgeted under the blanket and began to chuckle softly, smiling sheepishly. The girl merely thought, and that was unexpected, "I want to try growing a tree, but I've never looked after them." The boy spoke. The lady sat next to him on the big crib. She looked at the floor, thinking about her adopted son's words. With a barely noticeable grin, the fair-haired girl repeated the little prince's wish to herself. A luxurious tree, that is. She walked slowly along colorful flower garden, looking at the different flowers and trees. "My God, Her Excellency is talking about flowers. Heaven and earth must be changing places," the man exclaimed in amazement. He raised his hand, looking in amazement at the cold-blooded archduchess before him. "Stopping," the guy said incredulously. "Does this really mean that you finally—" The girl, sensing a catch, turned sharply to him. The dark-skinned man quickly went down, closer to the ground where the flowers were growing. "Have you finally decided to accept my love?" the young man asked lovingly. He was already kneeling in front of the fair-haired lady. Skillfully pulling her hand to himself, the man tried to kiss it, holding it tightly in his hand. But having correctly calculated the force, with the same fragile hand that was at lips of the smug man, the girl hit him on the nose with all her might. A loud sound of damaged bones was heard, and the guy himself jumped back a couple of steps from the lady. The witch walked away from the boy, wiping the blood from her hands with a snow-white handkerchief. "The tree must be beautiful and frost-resistant," the girl continued, speaking in a cold voice, turning to the youth with displeasure. The man stood up from the grass and wiped the blood off his face. His nose was broken, and a stream of blood was dripping from it. He ignored it and thought about the lady's words. Even among monsters, it was rare to find a species that bloomed in the cold. Plus, if it was beautiful, it would be much harder to find. "So you're not saying that such trees don't exist? The cost is not important. I'll pay enough," the girl spoke, frowning slightly at the sight of her slightly broken old acquaintance. She looked at the man with displeasure. Blushing, the boy said, "I don't need payment. You know that one kiss from you will be enough for me." He emphasized the last word, showing its importance. He playfully ran his finger over his own lips, looking coldly at the man. The fair-haired girl said irritably, "Never heard of someone dying after 3 kisses with the Snow Queen." She turned away from the guy, tiredly. "If I can die after your kiss, it will be even more romantic," the guy exclaimed joyfully. It seemed like he was about to light up with happiness. Butterflies swirled around him, and he himself raised his hands up in approval. "He's not just crazy, he's completely nuts," the fair-haired witch thought, watching the cheerful and at the same time crazy behavior of the dark, brave man. She waited irritably for his fit of affection to end. "I am very happy." Suddenly, the young man's clear voice spoke again. "After all, I am the only one in the entire history of Belos," the blonde continued, making long pauses between words, as if savoring them. He was already standing there flushed, although the Archduchess was simply standing in one place. "Who saw Your Excellency standing among the flowers?" The man with yellow eyes spoke admiringly. In them, he saw a beautiful girl who stood shyly among the bright flowers. "After all, it was not in vain that I created this flower garden," he said at the end. "Does he spend all day at home, just learning phrases like that?" How disgusting, the witch thought. Looking at the young man's unsuccessful advances, she was about to start gagging. But he was a very shy little boy when he was a child, the girl thought, remembering those good old days when the man was just a little boy who hid behind his parents, embarrassed to look at the witch. But now, this was not a shy guy at all. He could calmly make his unsuccessful jokes at her, casually call her his queen, flirt with a rose in his teeth. What went wrong? The witch thought doomedly. "Well, I have to choose a flower tree," the girl thought, breaking away from her own thoughts. This boy had spoiled her mood again, and so she only sullenly looked for something that might please the little prince. Somewhere in the distance of the huge hall, she saw a blossoming tree. It was flooded with bright sunlight from the panoramic windows. It glowed brightly and stood out against the background of other plants, because they did not even have flowers. It looks luxurious, quite a good option, the girl thought, approaching the plant. Its flowers were bright orange, and in some places they were red. The wide-open buds smelled pleasant. "Do you really like it?" the dark-skinned blonde asked. "What is it?" The blonde witch answered the question with a question. She turned her face to him abruptly, ceasing to examine the bright, blooming, and lonely tree. "It's called camellia," the man answered smilingly. It was very difficult to get hold of. His bright yellow eyes stared at the flower tree that was perfect for the cool-blooded archduchess. "It can bloom or be used as an ingredient for a potion, so I think you'll really like it," the blonde said, smiling brightly. The girl just looked at him in surprise, not quite understanding what he meant. "If you look closely, it becomes clear that this is an ordinary dongbaek. Judging by the fact that the author of the book is Korean, it seems that his imagination also has limitations," the girl thought, looking at the flowers that had long been familiar to her. "He has a bit of a terrible character, but I'm sure he'll be humble in front of you," the man said boastfully, crossing his arms. "How terrible is his character?" the fair-haired lady asked the boy. "Well, he won't inflict a mortal wound," the man answered thoughtfully, "but occasionally he might cut off some fool's fingers." He scratched his nose awkwardly. "They also call him a cutter of fingers." The boy finally finished his speech. "What?" the blonde lady exclaimed in fear. She had already imagined the severed, bloody finger of the little golden-haired prince. "Crazy. How can I give this to a 7-year-old child?" the lady thought in amazement. "Should I look for another one?" the witch muttered thoughtfully under her breath, looking at the high ceiling of the hall. However, the man heard it clearly enough. "Are you worried?" he asked. "It is quite smart, and therefore will not encroach on your fingers, although the old butler will have to be a little more careful," the blonde said, mockingly, imagining the man without a finger. "My finger," the butler would exclaim, and next to him would be a horrible and disgusting plant. "Since you're worried, you might as well kill all his energy from the start." The dark-skinned blonde, with yellow eyes, began to wail cheerfully. He hit his palm with his fist, imagining what the snow lady could do to poor Camellia. "If you hit it, does it become calm?" the cold-blooded archduchess asked in a distrustful voice. She looked at her interlocutor in surprise, slowly turning her head towards him. Her light locks of hair reflected the bright sunlight in the hall, which made the lady seem to shine. "Of course, no matter how strong it is, everyone bows before a stick," the boy said indifferently. "Okay, fine." The lady quickly answered him. She swung with all her might, and the man next to her only tried to jump away from her, as if dancing. Having looked at the plant, the girl addressed her old acquaintance for the last time. "I'll take it, deliver it to the castle." The man reacted instantly. Yes, I'll deliver it as soon as possible," he exclaimed. "But why do you suddenly need a flower tree?" the boy asked, puzzled. "It's none of your business," the snow lady answered him indifferently. "For simple decoration. That's not fun at all," the blonde convinced her, and then, muttering under his breath, he said, "I don't think you want to give it to the butler." The man continued his own thoughts, quietly speaking under his breath. "Perhaps you want to give it to the human cub who recently arrived to you." "A male?" The lady froze in place at such impudence and then turned to him in a cold voice. "Ravel." "What?" the dark-skinned blonde asked the fair-haired witch in fear. He drew out the word, afraid to hear the cold voice of the lady with threats again, and so he could only smile happily, waiting for the next actions of the archduchess. The blue-eyed beauty turned her head sharply towards him, and with wide eyes, repeated his words. "You said that everyone bows, didn't you?" She looked menacingly at the young man behind her. Suddenly the boy felt scared. He closed his eyes, pretending to squint from a smile. But in fact, he was afraid to look again into those indifferent deep eyes, in which only silent danger shone through. It was already sunset outside the window. The sky was turning pink, and more orange rays of the sun were penetrating the hall. "Forgive me," the man said in a trembling voice. "Don't poke your nose in where it doesn't belong, if you don't want to turn into a steak at such a young age." "Well, I'm off," the lady said finally, leaving the greenhouse. The man bowed quickly and exclaimed, "Yes, have a good trip, Your Excellency." The girl only nodded emotionlessly in response, taking care of the plant that his beloved liked so much. The man laughed awkwardly, remembering that he would soon see the Snow Lady. He carefully replanted the tree so that the Archduchess would like it more. 2 days later, the plant was ready, and the man himself went to deliver it. "And you're fast." The fair-haired witch met him in the garden near the estate. "Well, of course," the boy answered her boastfully. "It's hard to find anyone from Rikon who could match me in speed," the dark-skinned boy said proudly, smiling playfully, broadly and brightly. As always, he looked defiantly at the Snow Lady. The girl remembered a brightly blooming tree with large orange flowers. "But, by the way," the blonde asked, turning to the man from Rikon, "why is this tree so different from the one you had in your flower bed?" In his hands, the young man held tightly a pot with completely dark green foliage. The leaves were prickly and dangerous, and therefore they did not attract the eye. "After all, there is not a single flower on it," said the blonde witch, interested in this question. He quickly gave an answer. "It's because it's still too young. It will most likely remain like this for another 7 years, and no matter what favorable atmosphere it lives in, if it doesn't like something, the flowers won't bloom." The lady answered, "What arrogance! Well, you're still a good girl. Catch it." The girl addressed the blonde without emotion. She threw an object at him from a short distance. He looked at the blonde witch in surprise, not understanding what was flying at him. Deftly holding the tree with only one hand, the young boy caught the thing thrown at him with the other. It was a shiny ring. He was surprised when he saw it, and asked the girl with blue eyes for it. "Is this a ring?" "Your Excellency, I do not need payment," the dark blonde said guiltily, holding out both palms to her. On them lay a silver ring. "You can consider Camellia to be proof of my love," he said. The fair-haired witch answered, laughing languidly and barely audibly. "In that case, I suppose I should prove my love too." She smiled wickedly, squinting her eyes. Her snow-white skin reflected the sunlight like porcelain. The girl almost pounced on him with her fists at that very second. The man with long blonde hair practically screamed in fear. "Got it. I'll take him. I'll take him," the boy repeated with a trembling voice. The dark-skinned man thought he saw someone behind him. He pricked up his ears and looked back with his peripheral vision. A childish golden-haired head and red eyes, burning with curiosity, were peeking out from the tree. "Tita, what are you doing?" the Snow Lady asked in a worried voice. "Come closer," she called him to her, leaving her old acquaintance standing there in bewilderment. The boy looked at the stranger. The man looked at the little golden-haired prince in front of him in amazement. The boy was still hiding behind the tree. The lady behind him did not share his surprise, for he had long been her adopted son. "Could it really be this little boy?" he said barely audibly. Looking into the little prince's face, the man exclaimed triumphantly, "It was him." He laughed loudly, coming closer to the boy. The little tyrant shuddered from such an unexpected visit from an unexpected guest, who was now also admiring him. The boy quickly ran closer to the frightened child. "Hello." The man greeted him warmly. "Don't do such nonsense to the child, Ravel." The blonde witch, standing behind the two boys, began to wail in a displeased voice. "Dear young gentleman, what is your name?" the dark-skinned blonde asked in a gentle voice. "I told you not to talk nonsense." A girl's scream was heard from somewhere behind. A small boy said, in a barely audible whisper, "Tita, your name is Tita. What an unusual name," the boy said, in surprise. "It sounds like a burning flame," he exclaimed. laughing good-naturedly at his own joke. "And what is your name?" the little prince asked him awkwardly. "My name is Ravel. Nice to meet you, Tita," the man said, smiling broadly, with all 32 teeth. He bared his fangs to the boy, which undoubtedly caused a childish, inquisitive surprise in the boy. "Brother Ravel," the blushing boy said barely audibly. His eyes shone as if he had seen something amazing, incredible, incomprehensible. He was always glad to meet new people, and they had a good time together. The lady thought distantly. "Brother, did you bring this tree?" the little golden-haired prince asked in surprise. "Yes," the man answered briefly, and nodded. The boy looked with admiration at the small tree in the garden pot, which was completely covered with greenery. "It must have been hard for you to carry it alone," the little tyrant asked worriedly. Smiling slyly, the dark-skinned blonde answered boastfully, chuckling slightly. "How kind you are, but that's nothing to me." "You're so cool," the boy said, as he exhaled. He was able to bring this big tree. The boy continued to praise Raver, as his small childish palm reached closer to the tree, trying to touch it. The blonde, coming to her senses, cried out loudly, "Tita!" She remembered the danger of the tree, mentally already imagining the severed finger. For a moment she shuddered and held her breath, afraid of what would happen next. The blonde witch screamed even louder, coming closer to the child. "It's dangerous, so don't go near it," she exclaimed loudly. Her hair was blown by the wind from her sudden movements, and her eyes were dark with fear. For a moment the girl froze, not daring to move. What she saw shocked her much more than what she had seen before. She opened her eyes wide, because at first she did not believe what she saw. With his little hands, the golden-haired prince calmly rummaged through the foliage of the bloodthirsty evergreen tree, which could have bitten off anyone else's arm at the elbow for such impudence and arrogance. "So soft," the little boy muttered, kneading the dark green of the tree more and more. The boy looked at the long-awaited plant with fascination, not understanding why his mistress was looking at him so strangely. "It also dances. How cute!" The golden-haired child spoke in an anxious voice. The plant in front of him twisted first one way, then the other, not staying in one place for long. The boy watched the unusual dance, fascinated. "He seems to be in a good mood," the little tyrant said, holding the tree closer to himself. He began to stroke its green petals again, carefully. The two adults, standing in front of him, were clearly shocked. Still, the girl thought, in a frightened, stuttering voice, this is how the main character of a magical land, receiving the patronage of the whole world, should look. She smiled a little awkwardly, looking at the strange games of the boy. The dark-skinned brunette muttered under his breath, puzzled. "Camelia's hobby is to cut off people's fingers. How can she be so pliable?" The man looked fearfully at the plant that had recently almost bitten a man. The boy jumped up from his seat and ran up to the boy with red eyes. "Baby, who are you?" a loud male voice exclaimed. The little prince was frightened by it, and then began to tremble slightly, rubbing his palms. "What difference does it make to you?" the blonde witch asked, in a displeased voice from behind, as she pushed him hard away from the trembling little golden-haired prince. The man, already accustomed to the cruelty of the Snow Lady, only whined sadly. "Do you like it, Tita?" the Archduchess asked in a worried voice. "Yes, Your Excellency. I like it very much." The boy blushed with emotion, and his eyes sparkled with joy. "But why did you suddenly buy this flower?" the child asked puzzledly. "The castle looked too gloomy, so I bought it to change the overall atmosphere a little. If you like it, you can put it in your room." The lady answered thoughtfully, studying the sunny sky. "Thank you very much, Your Excellency," the little prince said, happily, smiling warmly at his snowy mistress. The dark-skinned blonde could only stare in bewilderment at the unfolding picture right in front of him. The man with the protruding snow-white ears smiled brightly. He said in amazement, "He can so skillfully control the merciless camellia." He had no idea what kind of boy this was, but he knew one thing for sure. He had insane strength. Watching the happy boy, who was happily laughing at the tree, hugging it tighter and tighter. He muttered to himself, saying, "Excellent from rumors. This is really an incredible baby." The lady looked sternly at her old acquaintance and said coldly, "Enough. If you have finished your business here, then leave quickly." The man pretended that her words pierced his heart with sent arrows. "Your Excellency, you are too cold," he exclaimed. Laughing, the man quickly and deftly dropped to one knee again. "Well, then I'm going back to my place," the boy said, as if not noticing the surprised face of the snow lady, and behind him, the even more shocked face of the child. Leaving a light kiss on her hand, the dark-skinned blonde, touching his cheeks with his palm, said that he would look forward to their next meeting. He smiled shyly when he felt his cheeks turn purple. "You're an idiot," the blonde witch screamed at the top of her voice, shocked by the man's insolence. There was no trace of good manners here. She swung her fist at him, but the boy managed to deftly dodge the blow of justice. "Bye, Tita. See you later," the blonde shouted at the child, who was still standing by the tree, not moving away from him for a single step. The girl only shouted a few kind words after him, but this did not affect his bashful escape from Belos. Gritting her teeth, the blonde said barely audibly, almost in a whisper, "What a snake in the grass." The boy, not understanding why such emotions were caused, awkwardly asked, "Listen, Your Excellency." "What?" the blonde witch asked the little prince, in a displeased voice, slowly turning her head towards him. "Why did your brother kiss you?" the little boy asked, not even realizing the essence of his question. "Isn't it usually only those who have feelings for each other who kiss? Your Excellency and your brother love each other," the boy asked, confused, trying to figure out what had happened. "What?" the lady thought. "No way. Why would I like someone like him?" the girl exclaimed loudly. Finally moving away from his tree, the boy asked again, "What? But then why?" But his childish and ringing voice was interrupted by the blonde witch. She was clearly nervous, and therefore tried to stop the rest of the child's questions right away. "Sometimes a person is kissed in order to express their respect," the lady exclaimed. A logical thought came to the boy's head. "Then since I respect Your Excellency and Mr. Edmund, should I kiss his hands?" the boy said, imagining how touched they would be by such a gesture of respect. The girl suddenly shuddered. "No, only adults do that, so you don't need to know yet. I'll tell you everything properly when you're older," the girl said quickly, looking at the blue roses. "Very well, Your Excellency," the prince answered, seeing how much trouble a single gesture of attention from the dark-skinned blonde had caused her. She blushed, and then frowned, indignant at the capricious behavior of her old acquaintance. He had been like that before, but he hadn't caused trouble, the lady thought. The man was still running away from Belos's lands. "Ravel, you won't get off so easily the next time we meet," the fair-haired witch decided. The girl understood that this was unlikely to be their last meeting, and therefore a plan had to be prepared immediately. Edmund looked extremely surprised. A smile was shining on his face. The man leaned slightly and addressed Her Excellency and Tita, who was standing next to the Archduchess. There was delight in the butler's eyes. He looked at the potted tree standing right in front of him and asked what kind of tree it was. In fact, the man had not seen green in these cold wastelands for so long that the sight of this living tree seemed strange to him. The butler also noted that, judging by the fact that buds had already appeared on this tree, flowers should soon bloom. Cleet raised one eyebrow, showing displeasure, and said that some idiot said that they would have to wait 7 years. The butler could not figure out what kind of plant it was. The tree had such lush and fragrant leaves, it seemed that such could not be found in the territories of Belos. Edmund reached out his hand to the green leaves, but noticing what the butler was trying to do, the Archduchess immediately called out to him. The girl said that it was a camellia, and if he valued his fingers, it would be better not to approach the plant at all. The butler's hand trembled, and he immediately moved away from the tree. After finishing her sentence about the danger of the tree, the witch added that the plant was a monster. This was also one of the many reasons to stay away from it. The girl's eyes lit up when she mentioned monsters. Edmund abruptly ran back a few steps. The man was afraid of everything that could threaten his life or health, so the words about the monster affected him so much. Tita remained standing in place, as if nothing bothered him. The boy stood and listened, as Edmund, in a trembling voice, tried to convey to the witch that she should warn about such things in advance. And she continued to repeat that it would be more interesting if something happened. Thinking over everything that had happened once more, Edmund remembered that he had heard about this plant before. It was a very rare flower that only grew in the east. The man sincerely did not understand where and how Clat had managed to get it. The witch replied that she had taken the flower from Ravel's flower garden. She thought the castle was too gloomy, and the new year was approaching, so she took the plant. Indeed, the green color of the foliage brightened the atmosphere a little. Edmund noted that the girl usually didn't care about the upcoming holidays, but now something had changed. Hearing his suggestions, Clayt ordered him to be quiet and justified herself by saying that she didn't need a reason to do anything. Having finished the previous phrase, the girl turned to Tita, telling him that she would now move Camellia to his room. The boy looked at her in bewilderment and shuddered. He was afraid that such a dangerous plant would be in his bedroom. He hesitated and started mumbling something under his breath. Cleet couldn't make out a word and asked again. Maybe he didn't like the plant? The boy answered that it was not like that at all, but his face looked extremely upset. Then the boy looked up at her and said that he had just been thinking for a while. Now he was trying to find the words to dissuade the witch from putting the camellia in his room. But the right expressions just wouldn't come to mind. After a short pause, Tita finally said that he would like to leave the tree in the living room next to the fireplace. There it would not die from the cold and would bring much more benefit and much less harm than in his room. And another advantage of this arrangement was that in this case, Edmund and Clayt would be able to admire this tree. Tita wanted everyone to be happy. It was his little naive wish. Clayt and Edmund looked at him questioningly. The butler's cheeks turned slightly red, and a smile blossomed on his face. The man was glad that Mr. Tita was truly very thoughtful. For him, the ice castle was the place where you start to miss the color green. Cleet listened to all the arguments and nodded her head. There was a semblance of a slight smile on her face, too. The girl said that if the majority wanted it that way, then it wasn't a bad idea. In fact, she liked the tree's placement, too. The witch said that from that day on, Tita would look after the camellia and be responsible for it. This was the first task she gave him. Meanwhile, Snowball approached the plant and began to sniff it. Cleet continued to talk about the boy's duties, about how he had to give her water and fertilizer every day so that the flowers would bloom someday. Meanwhile, Snowball and the plant were having a real fight. Cleet also said that camellia flowers are very precious medicines that can help in her research. Now this little boy had such a big responsibility on his shoulders. At the end of her monologue, the girl asked if he could handle it. The witch smiled. She was confident in Tita's strength and that he could handle it. Cleet looked at the boy intently, waiting for his answer. Tita smiled broadly, his eyes shining with hope and delight, and his face reflecting all the positive emotions. He said that he could do this task and nodded his head. The boy looked so happy, as if he had just found another friend. Edmund and Clayt smiled as the boy approached the plant and asked the camellia to live in peace with him. The leaves of the plant rustled as if in agreement. Tita looked happy that he now had something to do that could brighten up his gray everyday life. After all the red tape with the plant was over, Edmund seemed to say, by the way, that if you think about it. He was silent for a second, thinking it over several times. The man looked as if he remembered something very important, being sure that he had not made a mistake. The butler said that Cleet's birthday was coming soon. Hearing this, the girl turned around. She saw the smiling butler. It seemed that this man was looking forward to this holiday more than she was. The girl was not at all thrilled by this news. She exhaled and asked if this day had really come so quickly. It seemed to her that they had just recently thrown a party for this occasion. And here it was again. Edmund said that it was recently, almost a year ago. The witch completely lost track of time. She could not believe that it was so long ago. But when you have lived for more than 200 years, it is possible to lose count. The girl thought that time was flying by very quickly. In fact, she no longer remembered what date her birthday was. She strained her brain and tried to remember at least something. But it was all in vain. And also, in this place there were as many as 13 months in a year. It seemed to her a feat that Edmund did not forget anything and arranged her birthday every time. This butler was extremely capable, so despite his meticulousness, the girl liked him. The man suggested that since their family had grown so much this year, he thought they could make the party even more special. Edmund seemed to enjoy parties of all kinds, but Clayt was not so keen on this. The girl said that she had celebrated birthdays hundreds of times. This one she was terribly tired of and did not want to throw any party. The atmosphere began to heat up, and Tita continued to hug the dangerous plant. Edmund asked the girl not to say such upsetting things, and added in a whisper that perhaps Mr. Tita would prepare a gift that would make the girl's mouth drop. The butler thought it was a good idea to celebrate the birthday. Clayt sighed and agreed, adding that she didn't want a small child to worry about such things. A small smile appeared on her face again. The witch never imagined that the man who killed her character in the original would give her something for her birthday. Then the girl asked if Edmund had prepared anything for his mistress. The man replied that, of course, his gift was ready. Clayt did not even doubt such an answer, and asked more for the sake of decency than to find out what she would be given. The witch said that it was so self-assured, and then an idea came to her mind. Edmund had never been very creative when it came to gifts. He always gave the same thing, so the girl dared to assume that this time would be no exception. Clayt frowned slightly and asked if this was another piece of clothing. Her gaze was darker than a cloud, realizing that this gift simply couldn't be anything else. Edmund always gave her pieces of clothing. The man also frowned and looked at the girl a little guiltily. Then she asked, if she already knew everything perfectly well. The man himself understood that giving the same thing was not very good, but he had very few options. The butler decided to tell the girl a little about his gift, so that she would not think that he would give something similar to last year's gift. He said that he had prepared a white fox cape, created by the Rykan tribe. It was in keeping with the nobility of Her Excellency. Hearing this, the girl became perplexed and hysterical. She did not know whether to laugh or cry. The witch asked how he could give her another white coat. Now there was no doubt, the butler had no creativity at all. Clayt called the butler a stupid old man and said he had no creativity, but he looked away and said that if she got angry, it was too late. The man seemed to like his gift idea. Edmund looked at Clayt and said that he had already finished this cape, which meant that he would definitely give it to her now. The girl was not delighted. Her closet was completely filled with the same type of clothes, which, of course, she did not like very much. Then he added that, unlike last year's gift, he had added pockets to it. The witch couldn't understand how this old man could become more and more annoying every year. He really was getting on her nerves. The butler heard the lady's reproach and replied that it was all thanks to her. Tita sat aside and listened to the entire dialogue from beginning to end. He thought that, on such an occasion, he too should give something. The boy was going through all the options available to him and couldn't think of anything. It was the first time he had ever given someone a birthday present. Tita had no idea what was customary to give in Belos or where he could get a present. His gaze fell on the camellia tree standing next to him. It seemed to the boy that it was glowing and sparkling, as if attracting his attention. A brilliant idea, in his opinion, came to the little boy's head, which required urgent implementation. He was pleased with his own guesses. Now all that was left was to figure out how to implement it. Half of the problem had already been solved, and that couldn't help but make him happy. The boy's cheeks were covered with a slight blush. He hoped that Cleet would like his gift.